I sat at table 42, tucked by the entrance of my sister's wedding reception, staring at the place card in front of me. Evelyn Hart, Security Personnel Family. My father had just finished his speech, his voice booming through the ballroom. At least we don't have to worry about security tonight. Evelyn's here with her flashlight. 200 guests erupted in laughter. My mother joined in, telling everyone how honest work comes in all forms, while gesturing at me like I was a charity case they'd graciously allowed in. My sister Chloe stood at the head table in her designer gown, saying nothing, just smiled. Like she'd smiled through 32 years of them treating me like the family embarrassment while she got everything, the love, the opportunities, the respect. I'd spent a decade building something they couldn't imagine, something I'd deliberately hidden from them. And tonight, sitting at that table by the door while they publicly humiliated me, I decided it was time they learned the truth. I pulled out my phone and made one call. Just one. 15 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. 10 sleek black limousines lined up outside in perfect formation. CEOs stepped out. A congresswoman, tech moguls, philanthropists, the most powerful people in the city. And they walked straight past my parents, past the head table, past every important guest in that room. They walked to me. What happened next shattered everything my family thought they knew. And by the end of that night, they understood exactly who I really was and what it cost them to underestimate me for 32 years. Stay until the end. Because the revenge I served. It was colder and more satisfying than anything they could have imagined. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 32 years old, and for the past decade I've worked as a freelance security consultant. At least that's what my family believes. The truth is far more complicated. But on this particular Saturday evening, as I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the parking lot of the Grandview Country Club, none of that mattered. Tonight, I was simply the disappointing daughter arriving at my sister's wedding. The venue was exactly what I'd expected. Chloe had always dreamed big, and our parents had spared no expense to make her day perfect. Massive white columns framed the entrance, and a red carpet stretched from the valet station to the grand doors. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, Mercedes BMWs, even a Bentley. My modest Honda looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. I'd debated whether to come at all. The invitation had arrived 3 months ago, addressed simply to Evelyn Hart, with no +1 delivered by mail rather than hand-delivered like I knew other family members had received theirs. But despite everything, some small part of me had hoped that maybe just this once, things would be different. I was wrong. The moment I stepped through those grand doors, a young woman with a clipboard and an overly bright smile intercepted me. "Name, please," she chirped. I told her and watched her manicured finger scan down the seating chart. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone else might have missed it. But I'd spent a lifetime reading the micro-expressions of disappointment on people's faces when they realized who I was in relation to the golden child bride. "Oh yes, here you are. Table 42, right this way." She led me through the elegant reception hall past tables draped in ivory silk and topped with towering arrangements of white roses and orchids. We walked past tables numbered in the single digits where I recognized distant relatives and family friends, all dressed in their finest and chattering excitedly. We kept walking, past the teens, past the 20s, past the bar, past the dance floor, past what seemed like every other table in the entire venue. Finally, we stopped. Table 42 sat in the corner nearest the main entrance, positioned between the coat check and the doorway to the service corridor. The location alone was message enough, but it was the place card that made my breath catch in my throat. There, in the same elegant calligraphy as every other card in the room, it read, "Evelyn Hart, Security Personnel Family." I stared at those words for a long moment. Security personnel. My parents knew I occasionally worked security jobs to supplement my income, or at least that's what I'd let them believe. But to label me that way at my own sister's wedding in front of 200 guests. The escort had already hurried away, eager to distance herself from the awkward situation. I stood there alone looking at that place card and felt the familiar ache settle in my chest. the same ache I'd carried since childhood whenever I was compared to Chloe, and found wanting. I sat down, smoothing my simple navy dress, the nicest thing I owned, or at least the nicest thing my family had ever seen me wear. Around me, other guests were beginning to arrive, filling the more prestigious tables near the head table where Chloe and her fiancé Marcus would sit. I recognized my Aunt Patricia as she passed, walking arm in arm with my Uncle George. She glanced my way, did a visible double-take at my location, and quickly looked away, whispering something to my uncle. They hurried past without greeting me. Then my parents arrived. Ray and Judith Hart made their entrance like royalty, my mother resplendent in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than my rent, my father distinguished in his custom tuxedo. They worked the room, stopping at each table to greet guests with warm hugs and hearty handshakes. I watched them draw closer to my corner, and despite myself, I sat up straighter. Maybe they'd at least acknowledge me privately, even if the seating arrangement made their feelings clear. My mother reached my table first. Her smile was brilliant, but it didn't reach her eyes as she looked down at me. "Evelyn, sweetheart, you made it." Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You look so tired, dear. Did you have to work a night shift before coming?" She said it with such false concern that several guests turned to look. My father joined her, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Well, at least we know the venue is secure tonight," he announced jovially, his booming laugh inviting others to join in. "Couldn't ask for better protection than having our own daughter standing guard at the door." A ripple of laughter spread through the nearby tables. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my expression neutral. My hands folded calmly in my lap. "The venue has its own security team, Dad," I said quietly. He waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm just joking, sweetheart. You know that." But his eyes told a different story. This wasn't a joke. This was a statement, a public declaration of my place in the family hierarchy. They moved on quickly, not waiting for my response, already turning their attention to the next table where guests were far more important, far more worth their time. I watched them go, that familiar weight pressing down on my shoulders. 32 years old, and I still felt like the invisible child, the one who existed only in the margins of my family's perfect picture. More relatives passed by as the reception filled. My cousin Jennifer paused, looking uncomfortable. "Evelyn, this seating, it's..." She trailed off, clearly unsure what to say. I gave her a small smile. "It's fine, Jen. Really." She squeezed my hand once sympathetically. Then her husband called her away to their table near the front. An older family friend, Mrs. Morrison, stopped next. "Still doing that security guard thing, dear. When are you going to find a real career? A nice girl like you should be thinking about settling down, not working odd jobs." Her words were delivered with such condescending concern that I had to grip my napkin under the table to keep my composure. The ballroom continued to fill with guests, everyone dressed in their finest, everyone laughing and celebrating, everyone except me sitting alone at my table by the door, positioned like exactly what my place card said. Security personnel, not family. Not really. I could see Chloe across the room, radiant in her white gown, surrounded by bridesmaids who fussed over her dress and veil. She glanced in my direction once, and for a moment our eyes met. I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt maybe, or discomfort. But then one of her bridesmaids said something and she turned away laughing. I'd lived my entire life in Chloe's shadow, always the plain one, the ordinary one, the disappointment. She was beautiful, charming, effortlessly successful at everything she touched. And I was just Evelyn. The daughter they remembered only when they needed someone to mock someone to elevate Chloe by comparison. I'd learned to live with it, to survive it, to smile through it. But tonight felt different. Tonight, sitting at that table with that label, I felt something shift inside me. That's when the lights from outside caught my attention. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined one side of the ballroom, I saw them. 10 sleek black limousines moving in perfect formation up the country club's long driveway. their headlights cut through the evening darkness like a fleet of ships approaching shore. One after another they glided toward the entrance, their synchronized arrival impossible to miss. Conversations around me began to falter as other guests noticed. The limousines came to a stop, one behind the other, directly in front of the main entrance. I felt something flutter in my chest, anticipation, vindication, perhaps even a touch of fear, because I knew exactly who had arrived. And I knew that in about 60 seconds, everything was about to change. The limousine sat there in perfect formation, their engines idling, but no one emerged yet. I watched several guests crane their necks toward the windows, curious about the unusual arrival, but the wedding coordinator quickly dimmed the ballroom lights and directed everyone's attention toward the head table. It was time for the speeches, and my father was already making his way to the microphone, his face flushed with champagne and self-importance. I forced myself to look away from those vehicles outside and focus on what was happening inside. My father tapped the microphone twice, producing a sharp feedback squeal that made everyone wince. "Testing, testing," he said with a grin, waiting for the laughter that always seemed to follow his attempts at humor. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening to celebrate our beautiful daughter Chloe and her wonderful husband-to-be, Marcus." The room erupted in applause. I clapped too mechanically, my eyes fixed on my father's face as he beamed with pride. This was the expression I'd spent my childhood longing to see directed at me just once. "You know," he continued, his voice taking on that storytelling cadence he used when he wanted everyone's full attention. "Judith and I have been blessed with 2 daughters, 2 very different daughters." His eyes scanned the room and landed on me sitting in my corner by the entrance. My stomach tightened. Chloe, as you all can see, is grace personified. Beautiful, accomplished everything a parent could dream of. He gestured toward the head table where my sister sat in her wedding gown looking like something out of a fairy tale. She smiled, accepting the compliment as her due, while Marcus draped his arm across the back of her chair possessively. "But we were also given another daughter," my father continued, and I felt every cell in my body tense. "Evelyn, our other blessing, who reminds us every day that success comes in many forms." There was an uncomfortable titter of laughter from some of the tables. I knew what was coming. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life at every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every occasion where my father had an audience. "Now Evelyn couldn't be here earlier to help with the setup because she was working," he said, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it sound quaint, almost adorable. "She's in security, you see. Keeps people safe. Very noble work." He paused for effect, and I could see the punchline building in his expression. "And I told Judith, I said, 'Honey, isn't it wonderful? We don't have to hire anyone to guard the doors tonight. Our own Evelyn can stand watch.'" The laughter that followed was louder this time, more confident. People turned in their seats to look at me, some with pity, others with amusement, a few with that particular kind of schadenfreude that comes from watching someone else be humiliated. I kept my face carefully neutral, though my hands were clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails were digging into my palms. My father was chuckling at his own joke, shaking his head as if he'd said something clever rather than cruel. "I'm kidding, of course," he added, though his tone suggested he wasn't kidding at all. "But really, we're grateful for both our daughters. One who makes us proud in the traditional sense, and one who keeps us humble." The words hit me like a physical blow. Keeps us humble. As if my entire existence was meant to serve as a counterpoint to Chloe's perfection, a reminder that not everyone could be exceptional. I looked toward the head table, hoping desperately that Chloe might say something, might stand up for me just this once. Our eyes met across the room. She looked uncomfortable, her smile faltering slightly, but she said nothing. Marcus whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, looking down at her plate. The moment passed. My mother rose from her seat, then moving to stand beside my father at the microphone. She was slightly unsteady, having enjoyed several glasses of champagne during the cocktail hour, but she composed herself with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent decades in social circles. "If I may add something," she said, her voice saccharine sweet. My father stepped aside, yielding the microphone to her. Ray is absolutely right. We are blessed with two very different daughters, and I want everyone here to understand something important. She paused dramatically, surveying the room with the air of someone about to impart great wisdom. In this family, we believe that honest work comes in all forms. Not everyone can be a star, not everyone can shine in the spotlight like our darling Chloe. Some people are meant for simpler paths, and there's no shame in that. Her eyes found mine, and the pity in them was almost worse than my father's mockery. Evelyn has always been our grounded one, our practical girl. While Chloe was winning beauty pageants and academic awards, Evelyn was... well, she was trying her best. And we love her for that effort, we truly do. The applause that followed her words was polite, but awkward. People didn't quite know how to respond to what was essentially a public declaration that one daughter was worthwhile and the other was merely tolerated. I heard whispers from the tables nearest to me. "That's harsh," someone murmured. "Poor thing," another voice said. "Can you imagine being compared to that sister your whole life?" But no one spoke up. No one challenged my parents' narrative. They all just accepted it as truth because if my own parents said it, it must be accurate. My mother returned to her seat looking satisfied with her contribution. My father reclaimed the microphone to continue with more conventional wedding speech material, talking about how he'd known Marcus was the right man for Chloe from the moment they met, how proud he was to welcome him into the family, how excited he was for the grandchildren that would surely follow. Through it all, I sat frozen at my table by the door, trying to maintain my composure while feeling like I was slowly being erased. My worth publicly diminished to nothing more than a cautionary tale. I glanced toward the windows again. The limousines were still there, and I could now see movement around them, doors beginning to open. My heart rate picked up. Just a few more minutes, I told myself. Just hold on a little longer. That's when I felt a presence beside my table. I looked up to find the venue manager, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and an anxious expression. He bent down, speaking in an urgent whisper that only I could hear. "Ms. Hart." He said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There are guests at the entrance asking for you specifically. They're quite insistent. They say they're here on your invitation." He paused, glancing nervously toward the doors. "Should I escort them in? Because Ms. Hart, there are quite a few of them, and they seem to be very important people." I looked up at the venue manager and gave him a slight smile. "Yes, please escort them in. They're expected." My voice was calm, but inside my pulse was racing. The manager nodded, though his expression suggested he had no idea what he was walking into, and hurried toward the entrance. I stood slowly smoothing my dress and walked to a position where I could see the main doors clearly. Around me, a few guests had noticed the commotion and were turning in their seats with curiosity. The grand entrance doors swung open, and the first thing everyone saw was the line of limousines through the glass, their doors opening in perfect synchronization. It was choreographed, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The conversations in the ballroom began to fade as more and more people turned to look. My father, still holding the microphone, trailed off mid-sentence about Marcus's promising career in real estate development. I watched his face as confusion replaced his jovial expression. From the first limousine emerged a tall man in his early 60s, his silver hair impeccably styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I recognized him immediately as Richard Thornton, CEO of Thornton Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast. From the second vehicle came a striking woman with dark skin and natural hair swept up in an elegant style, Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a renowned philanthropist who'd founded 3 major nonprofit organizations focused on education in underserved communities. The third limousine revealed Congresswoman Patricia Reeves, whose face had been on the cover of Time magazine just last month for her groundbreaking legislation on corporate accountability. One by one they emerged. A tech entrepreneur whose company had revolutionized cloud computing, a venture capitalist known for turning small startups into billion-dollar enterprises, a prominent attorney who'd argued cases before the Supreme Court, a healthcare executive who'd transformed hospital systems across the country, a best-selling author and social commentator whose books had shaped public discourse for a decade, an investment banker whose decisions moved markets. Each person who stepped out of those limousines was someone whose name carried weight, whose presence commanded attention, whose time was measured in millions of dollars per hour. The ballroom had gone completely silent. My father stood frozen at the microphone, his mouth slightly open. My mother's champagne glass was suspended halfway to her lips. Chloe had risen from her seat at the head table, her veil trailing behind her as she stared toward the entrance. The wedding guests were turning in their chairs, necks craning to get a better view, whispers beginning to ripple through the room like electricity. But it was the 10th limousine that held my attention. The door opened, and a woman emerged who made every other arrival pale in comparison. She moved with the kind of grace that comes not from youth, but from decades of absolute self-assurance. Victoria Chen was 72 years old, and she wore her age like a crown. Her silver hair was swept into a chignon that Grace Kelly would have envied, and her gown was a deep sapphire blue that caught the light with every movement. She'd been on the Forbes list more times than I could count, built an empire from nothing, and had personally mentored more female CEOs than anyone else in the country. She was also the closest thing to a mother I'd ever truly had. The 10 of them walked into the ballroom together, moving through the parted crowd of wedding guests, with the kind of presence that requires no announcement. People instinctively stepped back, creating a path though no one had asked them to. I saw phones being pulled from purses and pockets as guests frantically tried to identify who these people were, searching faces against Google Images confirming what they were seeing. The whispers grew louder. "Is that really Congresswoman Reeves? Oh my God, that's Richard Thornton. What are they doing here?" Victoria's eyes found mine across the room, and her face transformed with a warm smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She walked directly toward me, bypassing the head table, entirely ignoring my father, who still stood at the microphone, looking completely lost, not even glancing at my mother, who'd set down her champagne glass with a hand that trembled visibly. The other 9 followed Victoria's lead, forming a procession that cut through the center of the ballroom like a knife through silk. When she reached me, Victoria opened her arms, and I stepped into her embrace without hesitation. She held me the way a mother holds a daughter she hasn't seen in too long, with warmth and genuine affection and pride. "There you are, my dear girl," she said, her voice carrying in the silent room. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Why on earth are you sitting all the way back here?" She pulled back to look at me, her hands on my shoulders, and then glanced at my table by the entrance at the place card still sitting there with its damning label. Her expression shifted, something cold and dangerous flashing in her eyes for just a moment, before she masked it with a smile. The other 9 had gathered around us now, forming a protective semicircle. Richard Thornton extended his hand, and I shook it. "Madam Hart," he said with genuine warmth, "it's an honor to see you again." Dr. Okonkwo kissed both my cheeks in the European fashion. "You look wonderful, Evelyn. We wouldn't have missed this for anything." Congresswoman Reeves grasped my hand in both of hers. "When Victoria told us you'd be here, we cleared our schedules immediately. You know how much we all think of you." Each greeting was delivered loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear each title they used for me landing like a small explosion in the shocked silence. Madam Hart. Not Evelyn the security guard. Not the disappointing daughter. Madam Hart, spoken with respect, with deference, even by people who had no reason to defer to anyone. I could feel every eye in the ballroom on us. I glanced toward the head table and saw Chloe standing completely still, her bouquet forgotten in her hands, her mouth slightly open. Marcus had half risen from his seat, his expression unreadable, but intense. My mother had gone pale, one hand pressed against her throat. My father had finally set down the microphone, but he looked like a man who'd just watched his entire understanding of reality crumble. Victoria turned to the venue manager, who'd been hovering nearby, looking increasingly anxious. Her voice was pleasant, but carried an unmistakable authority. "I think Ms. Hart requires a more appropriate seat, don't you?" She glanced back toward the line of limousines still visible through the windows, their drivers standing at attention beside them. "We're here to celebrate Evelyn Hart after all," she continued, her smile sharp as a blade. "And we don't do anything halfway." The venue manager had barely stammered out a response when I heard the sharp click of my mother's heels approaching at a speed that was almost undignified. She materialized beside us with a smile so wide and bright it looked like it might crack her face in half. "Oh my goodness, what a wonderful surprise!" Her voice had that breathless quality she reserved for impressing people she considered important. "I'm Judith Hart, Evelyn's mother. We had no idea she'd invited such distinguished guests. Please forgive us, there must have been some terrible mix-up with the seating arrangements." My father appeared at her elbow. His face flushed not just from champagne now, but from what I recognized as panic barely contained beneath a veneer of bonhomie. He thrust out his hand toward Richard Thornton, pumping it with excessive enthusiasm. "Raymond Hart, sir. Such an honor to have you here. I've followed your work at Thornton Industries for years, absolutely brilliant business model." His laugh was too loud, too desperate. "There's been a bit of confusion about the seating completely. My fault, I should have reviewed the chart more carefully. Please let us get you all to proper tables immediately." Victoria regarded them both with the kind of cool assessment that I'd seen her use in boardrooms when evaluating whether a company was worth her investment. Her silence was more damning than any words could have been. My mother rushed to fill it, her hands fluttering nervously. "And champagne, of course, the best vintage. We have cases of the good stuff in reserve, not what we're serving to the general guests naturally. Let me have the staff bring it out immediately." She turned to snap her fingers at a passing waiter, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes betrayed her desperation. I watched this performance with a strange detachment, as if I were observing it from a great distance. This was the same woman who not 10 minutes ago had stood at that microphone and told 200 people that I was meant for simpler paths, that not everyone could shine. The same man who'd joked about me standing guard at the door. Now they were tripping over themselves to accommodate my guests, to pretend that the seating arrangement had been some clerical error, rather than a deliberate statement about my worth. Congresswoman Reeves spoke before I could, her voice cutting through my parents' nervous chatter with practiced political precision. "The seating was exactly where you intended it to be, I imagine. Right by the entrance. Quite the statement." Her smile was polite, but her words carried an edge that made my father's face go from flushed to pale in an instant. Before either of my parents could respond, I heard the rustle of fabric and turned to see Chloe hurrying toward us, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. Her face had that strained look of someone trying desperately to appear natural while internally screaming. "Evie." She used the childhood nickname with a familiarity that was jarring given that she hadn't called me that in over a decade. "Oh my gosh, I didn't know you were bringing guests. You should have told me, we would have made sure you had a better table." She reached out to take my hands and I let her, though I didn't return the squeeze she gave my fingers. Her palms were damp with sweat despite the cool air conditioning. "I'm so sorry about the seating, truly. You know how wedding planning gets crazy and things get mixed up." Her laugh was high-pitched, artificial. "But you're here now and your friends are here and that's what matters, right? We're so happy you came." She looked at Victoria and the others with wide eyes that were trying to convey warmth, but mostly conveyed terror. "Any friends of my sister's are friends of mine. Please, you all must stay for dinner. We have the most amazing menu planned." Marcus had followed Chloe from the head table and now stood slightly behind her, his expression impossible to read. He was staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't quite identify what was behind that stare. Recognition. Calculation, fear. Whatever it was, it felt different from the dismissive glances he'd given me earlier in the evening. Around us, the ballroom had erupted into barely suppressed chaos. I could see guests at every table with their phones out, fingers swiping and tapping frantically. A woman at the nearest table leaned toward her companion, her whisper carrying in the acoustics of the room. "That's Victoria Chen. Victoria Chen from Chen Ventures. She's worth $3 billion. Another voice from a different table responded in an equally loud whisper, and that's Congresswoman Reeves. What are they doing at this wedding? A man in an expensive suit stood up to get a better look. His phone held up to capture a photo, and several others followed suit. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where before there had been the comfortable buzz of a celebratory wedding reception, now there was electric tension, confusion, and most prominently, curiosity. Who was I really? That was the question I could see forming on every face. The disappointing daughter in the cheap dress sitting by the door didn't match with the woman who had 10 of the most powerful people in the country surrounding her like a protective guard. My father was still talking, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to smooth over the situation. Of course you'll all stay. The dinner is first-rate, absolutely first-rate. And we have entertainment planned, a live band dancing. Please, it would be our honor to host you all properly. He gestured toward the center of the ballroom, where the premium tables were located. We can rearrange some seating, make room at the family table even. The family table. The irony of that phrase offered now when it had been denied to me so completely an hour ago was almost too much. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw a man who was terrified. Not of Victoria or Congresswoman Reeves or any of the others, but of what their presence meant about me, about what he'd missed, about how catastrophically he'd miscalculated. Victoria placed a gentle hand on my arm, and I turned to meet her eyes. She gave me the smallest nod, a gesture of support that said whatever I wanted to do next, she would back me. The other 9 had arranged themselves in a loose circle around me, their body language protective without being aggressive, their presence a shield between me and my family. I took a slow breath and found that the tightness in my chest had loosened. For the first time all evening, I felt like I could breathe properly. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but in the hushed ballroom, every word carried with perfect clarity. Thank you all for coming, but I think I've celebrated enough for one evening. I began walking toward the exit, and Victoria and the others fell into step beside me, forming an honor guard that moved as one unit. The crowd of wedding guests parted before us automatically, people stepping back to create a clear path. I could feel their eyes on me, hear the whispers following in our wake, sense the shift in how they saw me. Not the family disappointment anymore. Something else entirely. Something they didn't understand, but recognized as power. As I reached the grand doors, I paused and turned back to look at my family one last time. My father stood frozen where I'd left him, his hand still half extended as if he could call me back with a gesture. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth, her carefully applied makeup beginning to streak as tears formed in her eyes. Chloe stood in her white dress looking small and lost, no longer the radiant center of attention, but just another confused guest at her own wedding. And Marcus watched me with that same intense expression, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating something I couldn't quite read. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply looked at them, let them see me seeing them, and then I walked out into the night. The cool night air hit my face as the country club doors closed behind us, and with it came a flood of memories I'd spent years trying to keep buried. Standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to be my family, I couldn't help but remember why I'd needed them in the first place. Why the family I'd been born into had never been enough. Why tonight's humiliation was simply the culmination of 32 years of being made to feel like I didn't belong. I was 7 years old the first time I truly understood that I was different from Chloe, and that different meant lesser. We were at a department store shopping for Easter dresses, and my mother had picked out a beautiful pink gown with lace trim for Chloe, who was 9. For me, she'd selected a plain white dress, simple and forgettable. I'd reached for a dress similar to Chloe's blue instead of pink, with the same pretty details. My mother had gently but firmly taken it from my hands and hung it back on the rack. That style looks better on girls who are naturally pretty, sweetheart, she'd said, smoothing my hair with what I now recognized as pity. Chloe can wear things like that because she has the face for it. You need simpler clothes that won't draw attention. I'd been too young to fully understand what she meant, but old enough to know it was bad. By the time I was 10, the comparisons had become constant background noise in my life. Why can't you sit up straight like your sister? Chloe got straight A's again, what happened with your report card? Look at how gracefully Chloe moves. You need to watch how she does it and try to copy her. Every accomplishment I achieved was measured against Chloe's and found wanting. When I won second place in the school science fair, my father's response was to remind me that Chloe had won first place when she was my age. When I made the honor roll, my mother pointed out that Chloe had made high honor roll. Nothing I did was ever enough because I was being compared to someone who in my parents' eyes was fundamentally better than me. The cruelest part was that Chloe herself wasn't mean to me. She didn't have to be. She simply existed in her golden bubble of parental adoration while I scrambled for whatever scraps of attention might fall my way. She'd smile at me kindly when our mother criticized my appearance as if to say she understood it wasn't personal. But it was personal. It was deeply fundamentally personal, even if she couldn't see it. I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. If I couldn't be the pretty daughter or the accomplished daughter, I could at least be the daughter who didn't cause problems. I stopped asking for things. I stopped expecting praise. I stopped hoping that maybe this time they'd be proud of me. At family dinners, I'd sit silently while they discussed Chloe's latest achievement or admired her newest outfit. At holidays, I'd watch them fuss over her while I helped in the kitchen, unnoticed and unacknowledged. I became a ghost in my own home, present but not really seen. The scholarship letter arrived during the spring of my junior year in high school. I'd applied to a prestigious international studies program in London without telling anyone certain that I wouldn't get in, that it was foolish to even hope. But I had gotten in. Not only that, they were offering me a full scholarship covering tuition, room, and board, everything. It was the first time in my life that someone outside my family had looked at me and decided I was worth investing in. I'd held that letter in my trembling hands and felt for the first time like maybe I was more than just the disappointing daughter. I'd shown my parents at dinner that night, my voice shaking with excitement and hope. My father had barely glanced at it before handing it back. "That's nice, honey, but you know we can't let you go gallivanting around Europe. Girls your age need supervision." My mother had been more direct. She'd set down her fork and looked at me with that same patient pity from the department store years earlier. "Evelyn, sweetie, be realistic. You're 17. Girls don't need all that education, especially not overseas where we can't keep an eye on you. Besides, we need to save our resources for Chloe's college applications next year. She's applying to some very competitive schools." I'd tried to explain that it was a full scholarship, that it wouldn't cost them anything, but my father had waved his hand dismissively. "It's not about the money. It's about what's appropriate. You should be thinking about practical careers, something local, where you can help the family if needed. Chloe is the one with the real potential for a big future. Let her have the opportunities. You'll understand when you're older that this is what's best." I'd gone to my room that night and cried for hours, the acceptance letter crumpled in my fist. The message was clear even when I succeeded on my own merit, even when someone else saw value in me. My parents still believed I should step aside for Chloe. My dreams, my potential, my future, all of it was secondary to ensuring that my sister got every possible advantage. But the moment that crystallized everything, the memory that still burned after all these years, happened a few weeks later. I'd come home early from school and heard voices in the living room. My mother was having coffee with her friend Nancy, and I'd started toward the kitchen when I heard my own name. I'd frozen in the hallway, hidden from view, but able to hear every word. Nancy had asked how both daughters were doing, and my mother's response had carved itself into my memory like words etched in stone. "Oh, Chloe is wonderful as always. She just got accepted to 3 Ivy League schools. Can you imagine? We're so proud we could burst." There was a pause, and then Nancy must have asked about me because my mother's voice had changed, becoming flat and dismissive. "Evelyn? Oh, she's just there. You know every family needs a practical child, someone grounded. But Chloe is our real blessing. She's the one who's going to make something of herself, make us proud to tell people she's our daughter." I'd stood in that hallway, 17 years old, listening to my mother reduce my entire existence to just there, and something inside me had broken. Or perhaps it had finally hardened into something unbreakable. That night, I'd opened my diary to a blank page and written in shaking handwriting, "One day they'll have to remember I exist." I'd written those words in my diary with such conviction, such desperate hope, but I'd had no idea how to make them come true. 2 days after overhearing that conversation, after my mother had reduced my existence to just there, I'd made a decision that terrified me even as I acted on it. I'd packed a backpack with clothes, taken the $243 I'd saved from babysitting jobs, and left home while my parents were at one of Chloe's award ceremonies. I'd left no note. I didn't think they'd notice right away, and I was right. It took them almost 18 hours to realize I was gone. I'd ended up at the Greyhound bus station downtown, a grimy building that smelled of diesel fuel and desperation. I'd bought a ticket to somewhere anywhere, but the next bus wasn't leaving until morning. So I'd sat on one of those hard plastic chairs bolted to the floor, my backpack clutched against my chest, and tried to figure out what came next. I had enough money for the bus ticket and maybe a week of cheap meals. But beyond that, I had no plan. I was 17, legally, still a minor with no job prospects and no place to go. The reality of what I'd done began to sink in as the hours passed and the station emptied out. By midnight, I was one of only a handful of people still there. A janitor mopped the floors with disinterested efficiency. A man in a torn jacket slept sprawled across 3 chairs near the vending machines. And me, a scared teenager who'd run away from home because she couldn't bear to be invisible anymore, but had no idea how to become visible. I'd curled up on my chair using my backpack as a pillow and tried to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice. She's just there. Just there. Not wanted, not valued, just there. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to someone sitting down in the chair beside me. I jerked upright, instantly alert, and frightened my hand clutching my backpack. But the person who'd sat down wasn't threatening. She was a woman probably in her mid-50s, dressed in clothes that even my inexperienced eye recognized as expensive. Her dark hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a neat bun. She wore minimal makeup, but carried herself with a kind of natural elegance that made her beautiful despite, or perhaps because of her age. She was holding 2 wrapped sandwiches and a bottle of water. "You look hungry," she said, simply offering me one of the sandwiches. Her voice was cultured, educated, with no trace of pity in it. Just a statement of fact. I should have been suspicious. Strangers didn't just give food to teenage runaways at bus stations. But I was hungry, desperately so, and something about her felt safe. I took the sandwich with trembling hands. "Thank you," I whispered. She unwrapped her own sandwich and took a bite, as if we were having lunch at a cafe rather than sitting in a bus station at 1 a.m. "I'm Victoria," she said, "and you are clearly running from something. The question is whether you're running toward something as well or just away." I'd stared at her, this stranger who'd somehow cut through all my defenses with a single observation. "Just away," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I don't know where I'm going." Victoria nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's where most journeys start. We run from what hurts us before we figure out what we're running toward." She gestured to my backpack, to my rumpled clothes, to the bus ticket I'd left sitting on the empty chair beside me. "How old are you?" I hesitated, then decided the truth couldn't hurt at this point. 17. I turn 18 in 4 months. She was quiet for a moment, studying me with eyes that seemed to see more than I wanted to reveal. "Let me guess. Family doesn't appreciate you. Maybe they have another child they prefer, a golden child who can do no wrong, and you're tired of being the forgotten one. You've accomplished something recently, something you were proud of, and they dismissed it. So you decided if they won't see you, you'll leave entirely." Every word she spoke landed like she'd reached into my chest and pulled out my heart to examine it. "How did you know?" I breathed. Victoria's smile was sad and knowing. Because I was you 35 years ago. Different circumstances, same story. My parents had my perfect brother, and I was the daughter who wasn't quite pretty enough, quite smart enough, quite anything enough. I ran away too, though I made it farther than a bus station. She finished her sandwich and crumpled the wrapper in her hand. Want to know what I learned? I nodded, unable to speak. I learned that running away doesn't change anything unless you run toward something. And I learned that the best revenge against people who make you feel worthless is to become so valuable that they can't ignore you anymore. She turned to face me fully, and I saw something fierce and powerful in her expression. You're at a crossroads, and you're young enough that you might not see it yet. You can spend the rest of your life trying to get your family to love you, to see you, to validate you. You can shape yourself into whatever you think they want and still never be enough. Or you can decide that their opinion doesn't define your worth. You can build a life so substantial, so impactful, so undeniably significant that one day they'll be the ones desperate for your attention. She leaned back in her chair, studying me. Live so that one day people will need you, not the other way around. That's real power. That's real freedom. I felt something shift inside me, like a door opening onto a path I hadn't known existed. But how? I asked, hating how young and lost I sounded. I don't have money, I don't have connections, I don't have anything. Victoria reached into her elegant leather purse and pulled out a business card, pressing it into my palm. You have determination, intelligence, and a hunger to prove yourself. That's more than most people start with. My name is Victoria Chen. I'm the CEO of Chen Ventures. When you're ready to build something, call me. I looked down at the card in my hand, feeling the weight of expensive cardstock, seeing the embossed letters that spelled out a name I didn't recognize then but would later learn was synonymous with power and success. Why would you help me? I asked. You don't even know me. Her smile was gentle. Because someone helped me once, when I was sitting in a place not unlike this, feeling exactly how you feel now. And because I see something in you that your family is too blind to see. Potential. She stood, gathering her purse. Go home for now. You're not 18 yet, and running away will only give them legal leverage. But keep that card. Finish high school. Then call me and we'll talk about your future. She walked away without waiting for a response, her heels clicking against the dirty floor of the bus station, and I sat there holding that business card like it was a lifeline. Standing outside the country club 15 years later, Victoria's hand steady on my shoulder and her 9 colleagues surrounding me like guardian angels, I realized that moment had changed everything. That business card had been more than contact information. It had been a promise that I wasn't alone, that being underestimated wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning. I did go home that night just as Victoria had advised. I finished high school while working part-time jobs and avoiding my family as much as possible. The day after my 18th birthday, I called the number on that business card, and Victoria answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting. What followed were years of the most rigorous education I could have imagined, not in classrooms, but in boardrooms, investment meetings, and late-night strategy sessions in Victoria's office. She taught me how money worked, how power was accumulated and wielded, how to read people and markets with equal precision. By the time I was 23, I had an MBA from a program Victoria had sponsored, and 5 years of experience working in venture capital under her guidance. But even as I built this new life, I maintained careful contact with my family. I'd show up for major holidays with stories about my security work, dressed in modest clothes, driving that same old Honda. I'd listen to them talk about Chloe's successes, her career in marketing, her engagement to Marcus, and I'd nod and smile and play the role of the unremarkable daughter who'd found her appropriate place in the world. They never asked detailed questions about my work because they weren't interested enough to care. Security guard was exactly the kind of job they expected from me, blue-collar and simple, and it confirmed everything they'd always believed about my limited potential. The truth was that I did work security, but only one weekend a month at various events around the city. I maintained that job specifically to keep the story consistent, to have pay stubs and a supervisor who could verify my employment if anyone ever checked. It was a small price to pay for the perfect cover. The rest of my time was spent running Hart Capital Group, the investment firm Victoria had helped me establish 5 years ago when I turned 27. We'd structured it carefully with my name listed in the incorporation documents simply as E. Hart, and my photograph conspicuously absent from the company website and all promotional materials. Victoria had taught me that true power often operated best in the shadows, and I'd taken that lesson to heart. Hart Capital Group had grown faster than even Victoria's most optimistic projections. We specialized in identifying undervalued companies led by overlooked founders, particularly women and minorities, who struggled to get funding through traditional channels. It turned out that there was enormous profit in investing in people that others underestimated. I understood them because I was them. Within 3 years, we'd built a portfolio worth over $2 billion. By year 5, I was receiving calls from Fortune 500 companies seeking our investment expertise. Congresswoman Reeves had sought my input on financial policy legislation. Richard Thornton had invited me to join the board of his company. I'd spoken at conferences, consulted for major corporations, and built a network of influence that spanned industries and continents. And through it all, my family had no idea. They still saw me as Evelyn the security guard, the daughter who'd never amounted to much, the one who kept them humble. I could have revealed the truth at any time, could have shown up to a family dinner in a designer suit and announced my success. But Victoria had taught me something else. Timing was everything. Revenge served cold was a cliché, but revenge served at the perfect moment was an art form. So I waited and watched and gathered information. I hired a private investigator to look into my family's finances, curious about how they maintained their lifestyle of country club memberships and expensive weddings on my father's modest business income. What I discovered led me down a path I hadn't anticipated. My grandparents had died when I was 25 while I was building my company and deliberately staying distant from family events. I'd attended their funeral, but left immediately after, too busy and too hurt to linger. My parents had told me that my grandparents had left their estate equally to both daughters, about $30,000 each. I'd accepted this, signed the papers they'd sent me, and moved on, but the investigator had found inconsistencies. My grandparents' estate had been worth significantly more than $60,000. Their home alone had sold for $500,000. There were investment accounts, savings, a life insurance policy. When I'd pressed for details, the investigator had suggested I contact an attorney who specialized in estate law. That had been 3 weeks ago, and I'd hired someone immediately. The attorney had requested the original probate documents, and what he'd found had confirmed my worst suspicions. Someone had tampered with my grandparents' will. I'd suspected my parents were capable of many things, but this level of betrayal was something I hadn't fully imagined until I saw the evidence taking shape. The attorney had been tracking down the original will, the one filed with my grandparents' attorney before they died, and comparing it to the version that had been submitted to probate court. Tonight, standing outside the country club after walking away from my sister's wedding, I'd been waiting for his confirmation, waiting to know if my family's betrayal went even deeper than the emotional abuse I'd endured my entire life. Victoria squeezed my shoulder gently, pulling me back to the present moment. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." The other 9 had given us some space, standing near the limousines and talking amongst themselves, but I could feel their supportive presence. These were people who'd become my true family over the years, successful individuals who understood what it meant to be underestimated and to fight your way to the top despite it. "It was necessary," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "They needed to see that I'm not who they thought I was, that I never was." Dr. Okonkwo approached us, her expression concerned. "Are you all right, Evelyn? That was quite a scene in there." I nodded, managing a small smile. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in my life, I feel like I controlled the narrative instead of being controlled by it." My phone buzzed in my clutch purse, and I pulled it out expecting perhaps a message from one of my assistants or a business contact. But the name on the screen made my heart rate spike. It was my attorney, David Weinstein, and his message was brief but devastating in its implications. Found it. Your grandparents' original will. You were right, it was falsified. The original leaves you 70% of the estate, approximately $4.2 million. Your parents forged the probate documents. Call me tomorrow. This is actionable. I stared at the screen, reading the words 3 times to make sure I'd understood correctly. $4.2 million. 70%. My grandparents had wanted me to have the majority of their estate, had seen my worth even when my parents hadn't, and my parents had stolen it from me. They'd falsified legal documents, committed fraud, looked me in the eye, and lied about what my grandparents had wanted. My jaw tightened as the full weight of this betrayal settled over me. So it's true, I whispered, my voice hard as stone. They stole from me. I spent the 2 weeks following the wedding focused on my work and the evidence David Weinstein was compiling about the forged will. I deliberately didn't contact my family, and they didn't reach out to me either. The silence spoke volumes. They were scared, confused, trying to figure out what had happened at the wedding and what it meant. I knew they'd be investigating, trying to understand who I really was, and I was prepared for it. What I wasn't prepared for was how clumsy Chloe would be about it. The first indication came from Marcus Chen, my head of security at Hart Capital Group, no relation to Victoria despite the shared surname. He'd called me on a Tuesday morning, his tone professional but concerned. Ms. Hart, we've detected some unusual activity. Someone's been making inquiries about you, specifically about E. Hart and any connection to Hart Capital Group. They hired a private investigator, not a particularly sophisticated one. He's been contacting former colleagues, checking property records, running searches on various databases. Amateur hour, really, but persistent. I'd felt my stomach tighten. Do we know who hired him? Marcus had paused before answering. Your sister, Chloe Wellington. Well, technically still Chloe Hart on most documents since the wedding was only 2 weeks ago. She paid him $5,000 up front. I'd thanked Marcus and told him to keep monitoring but not to interfere. I wanted to know what Chloe would discover, how deep she'd dig, and what she'd do with the information. Part of me was curious whether she was investigating out of genuine concern or simply trying to figure out if there was money she could access. The cynical part of me, shaped by 32 years of being the forgotten daughter, suspected the latter. Over the next few days, Marcus sent me regular updates. The private investigator was thorough, if unimaginative. He'd found the incorporation documents for Hart Capital Group and identified E. Hart as the CEO. He'd pulled together a portfolio analysis showing the firm's $2 billion valuation. He'd even managed to get a copy of a speaking engagement I'd done at a financial conference 6 months ago, though the video quality was poor enough that it would be hard to identify me definitively if you weren't looking for it. What the investigator hadn't found was any photographs of me in my role as CEO. That had been deliberate on my part from the beginning. Victoria and I had structured everything to keep my visual identity separate from my professional one. Press releases used initials only. The company website featured the firm's logo and results, but no executive headshots. When I did public appearances, they were carefully controlled, and I'd made sure that professional photos never circulated widely. In an age of social media and constant documentation, maintaining that level of privacy required significant effort and expense, but it had been worth it for exactly this reason. On the Thursday of the second week, Marcus called again. She's planning to follow you tomorrow. The PI has identified your usual Friday morning routine, and he's advised her to observe you directly. She wants to see where you go. I'd smiled at that. Chloe had never been patient, and apparently waiting for the investigator's full report was taking too long. Let her follow, I'd said. In fact, make it easy for her. I'll take the usual route to the office park in the main garage, enter through the front lobby. Let's give her the full show. Friday morning, I'd dressed in one of my business suits, a charcoal gray Armani that fit like it had been painted on, paired with Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to my height. I'd styled my hair in the sleek, low bun I favored for important meetings, and applied makeup with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was part of the armor of power. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the CEO of Hart Capital Group, not the invisible daughter in the cheap dress sitting by the entrance at a wedding. I'd driven my other car, not the old Honda that my family knew, but the midnight blue Tesla I used for work, and headed downtown. I'd spotted Chloe's car almost immediately. She was driving a white BMW that Marcus had given her as a wedding present, and she was following me with all the subtlety of a parade float. She stayed 3 cars back on the highway, followed me into the downtown area, and even parked on the street with a clear view of the Hart Capital Group building when I pulled into the underground garage. I'd taken my time allowing her to position herself, making sure she had the perfect vantage point for what came next. The Hart Capital Group occupied floors 35 through 40 of the Millennium Tower, one of the most prestigious business addresses in the city. The building's facade was glass and steel modern, and imposing with the names of the major tenants displayed in elegant lettering near the main entrance. Hart Capital Group was listed prominently, and I'd watched from the lobby's security camera feed on my phone as Chloe stood on the sidewalk across the street, staring up at that sign with what looked like complete shock. I'd entered through the main lobby, and the security guard had greeted me by name. "Good morning, Ms. Hart." The elevator required a keycard for access to the executive floors, and I'd used mine aware that Chloe might have followed me inside and would see everything. The elevator arrived, and as the doors opened, I'd glanced back toward the lobby. Chloe was standing just inside the main entrance, her phone in her hand, her face pale. Our eyes met across the marble expanse of the lobby, and I'd seen the exact moment the reality hit her. Her sister, the failure, the security guard, the one who kept them humble, was about to ascend to the executive floor of a major investment firm. I'd stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 40th floor, the executive level. As the doors closed, I'd seen Chloe raise her phone to her ear, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The security feed from the lobby, which Marcus had pulled up for me on my phone, showed her pacing frantically while she waited for whoever she was calling to answer. Her expression was a mixture of shocked disbelief and something that looked almost like fear. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "She's in the lobby, making a call, pretty agitated. Want me to have security escort her out?" I typed back quickly. "No, let her process this. She's not a threat." The elevator had risen smoothly toward my floor, and I'd watched Chloe on my phone screen, seeing her mouth moving rapidly as she spoke to whoever had answered. From the way she was gesturing, the call wasn't going well. She kept pointing up toward the ceiling, toward where she'd seen me go, her face growing redder with emotion. I'd wondered who she was calling. My parents, most likely. Telling them what she'd discovered, demanding answers, trying to make sense of a reality that contradicted everything they'd believed about me for 32 years. The elevator doors had opened onto the 40th floor, where my assistant Sarah was waiting with my morning schedule and a coffee prepared exactly how I liked it. "Good morning, Ms. Hart. You have the acquisition meeting in 30 minutes lunch with Congresswoman Reeves at noon and the portfolio review at 3. I'd taken the coffee and smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. It's going to be an interesting day." Miles below in the lobby, my phone showed Chloe standing frozen. The call apparently ended, staring at her phone screen with an expression of absolute devastation. I imagined the conversation she'd just had, her voice shaking, as she told our parents the impossible truth. "Mom, Dad, Evelyn isn't a security guard. She's been lying to us. She's rich. Really, really rich. What the hell is going on?" The first phone call came exactly 3 days after Chloe's discovery. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my personal cell phone rang, the screen displaying Dad in letters I hadn't seen appear there in over 6 months. I let it ring 4 times before answering, watching the name flash on and off, feeling nothing but a cold curiosity about what he'd say. When I finally picked up, my father's voice was unnaturally cheerful, with an edge of nervousness underneath that I'd never heard before. "Evelyn, sweetheart, I've been meaning to call you for weeks now. Your mother and we've just been so busy with everything after the wedding, you know how it is." He laughed that same booming laugh from the reception, but it sounded hollow now, desperate. "We were thinking, why don't we all get together for dinner? It's been too long since we had a proper family meal. How about this Friday? Your mother wants to try that new Italian place downtown, the one that just got written up in the Times." I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out over the city skyline from my 40th floor office, and let the silence stretch between us. I could hear him breathing, waiting for my response, probably sweating. "I'm busy Friday," I said finally, my tone neutral and professional, as if I were declining a meeting with a potential client I had no interest in. "And most other evenings for the foreseeable future. But thank you for the invitation." "Oh, well, we can be flexible." His eagerness was painful to hear. "Saturday, Sunday brunch. You name the time, sweetie, we'll make it work. We just really want to see you catch up, hear about what you've been doing." What I've been doing, not how you've been or we miss you. What I've been doing. Because now that they knew I had money and power, suddenly my activities were worth their attention. "I'll check my calendar and get back to you," I replied, knowing I wouldn't. "I have a meeting starting in 2 minutes. I need to go." Of course, you're busy. We understand important meetings, big career woman now." He was trying so hard to sound supportive, proud even, but we both knew it was performance. "We'll talk soon." "Okay. Love you, sweetie." I ended the call without responding to that last part, and set my phone face down on my desk. The word love from his mouth felt like an insult, a commodity he was suddenly willing to offer now that I might have something he wanted. The calls kept coming after that, following a pattern so predictable I could have written a script for them. My father would call every Monday evening, always with some variation of the same message. They missed me. They wanted to spend time together. Family was important. Why was I being so distant? My mother started calling on Wednesdays, her approach slightly different but equally transparent. She'd start with concern about my health, asking if I was eating properly, getting enough sleep, taking care of myself. Then she'd transition into guilt, reminding me of family obligations, hinting that they were hurt by my absence, suggesting that I was being cold and ungrateful. I kept every conversation under 3 minutes, my responses monosyllabic, offering nothing they could use to engage me further. But it was Chloe's attempts that were perhaps the most grating, because they came wrapped in a package of false nostalgia for a relationship we'd never actually had. The text messages started arriving daily, sometimes multiple times a day. "Hey sis, been thinking about you. Want to grab coffee?" That was the first one, arriving at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. I deleted it without responding. The next day brought, "Remember when we used to share clothes and stay up late talking? I miss those days. Let's catch up." I stared at that message for a full minute, trying to remember a single instance of us sharing clothes or staying up talking like real sisters. It had never happened. Chloe's clothes had been designer labels carefully guarded in her walk-in closet, and our late-night conversations had consisted of her talking about herself while I listened from the doorway of her room, never quite invited all the way in. The messages continued, each one more desperately affectionate than the last. "Evie, I know things have been weird, but you're my sister and I love you. Can we please talk?" Then, "I feel like we've grown apart and I hate it. Let's have a girls' day, just us like we used to." Like we used to. The phrase appeared again and again, creating a fictional history of sisterly bonding that existed only in her imagination, or more likely in the story she was trying to sell now that circumstances had changed. I responded to perhaps 1 in every 10 messages, and my replies were carefully crafted to give nothing. "Busy with work. Can't this week. Maybe another time." Never an outright refusal that would let them claim I'd rejected them, but never an acceptance that would give them access to me. What fascinated me most was how quickly they'd all adapted their narrative about who I was. 32 years of treating me as the family embarrassment, and within 2 weeks of discovering the truth, they'd rewritten history in their minds. Suddenly, I'd always been important to them, always been loved, always been valued. The gaslighting was almost impressive in its audacity. They seemed to genuinely believe that if they just said the right words, made the right gestures, I'd forget everything that had come before and welcome them back into my life. As if decades of emotional abuse could be erased by a few phone calls and text messages filled with emoji hearts. I watched this performance unfold with the same detached interest I might observe a case study in my MBA classes. It was textbook behavior, really. People revealed their true values through their actions, not their words, and my family's sudden interest in me revealed exactly what Victoria had taught me years ago. Most people don't love you for who you are, they love you for what you can do for them. When I was nobody, I was worth nothing. Now that I was somebody, I was worth their time and effort. The calls reached a crescendo about 3 weeks into this campaign. I was working late in my home office when my mother called, and something about the time, nearly 10 at night, made me answer. Maybe I was curious to see how far she'd push. Her voice when she spoke was different from the previous calls, rawer, with less of the artificial cheerfulness. "Evelyn, please. I know you're angry and maybe you have a right to be, but we need to talk. We need to understand what's happening. You've shut us out completely, and it's tearing this family apart." I listened to her words, heard the tremor in her voice that might have been genuine emotion or might have been calculated manipulation, and felt absolutely nothing. "Tearing the family apart," I repeated softly. Interesting phrase, considering I was never really part of this family to begin with. Was I? She tried to interrupt, to protest, but I continued. "For 32 years you made it very clear that I was the lesser daughter, the disappointment, the one you tolerated but didn't value. You said it publicly at Chloe's wedding. You've said it 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways my entire life." "That's not fair," she said, and now her voice was cracking, breaking. "We've always loved you. Maybe we didn't show it the way we should have, but we're your parents, Evelyn. We're trying now. Please, Evelyn. We're family. You can't just shut us out." There it was, the word I'd been waiting for. Family. The shield they thought would protect them, the obligation they thought would bind me. I looked out my window at the city lights spreading out below my penthouse and thought about all the times I'd wanted to hear that word spoken with genuine love instead of convenient obligation. "Now you remember I'm family," I said quietly, my voice steady and cold as winter steel. Interesting timing. I ended the call and set my phone down, watching it light up immediately with her calling back. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, and then I turned it off completely, choosing silence over their desperate symphony of false affection. While my family waged their campaign of fake concern and forced affection, I turned my attention to something far more productive, dismantling Marcus Wellington's real estate empire piece by careful piece. It wasn't personal in the way they might have thought. I didn't hate Marcus, didn't even know him well enough for that level of emotion. But he represented everything about my family's priorities. The golden son-in-law who'd been celebrated while I'd been dismissed, and more practically his business dealings had caught my attention during the research I'd conducted before the wedding. Wellington Corp had some interesting vulnerabilities, and I intended to exploit every single one of them. The irony was that Marcus had been trying to court Hart Capital Group's investment for nearly 6 months before the wedding. His company had submitted a proposal back in February requesting a $20 million credit line to expand his luxury condominium developments. The proposal had landed on my desk, and I'd assigned one of my senior analysts to evaluate it. The numbers were decent, nothing spectacular, but not terrible either. We'd strung him along with requests for additional documentation, revised projections, more detailed market analysis. Standard due diligence, or so it would appear. In reality, I'd been stalling, waiting to see how the wedding would play out, curious whether my family would surprise me. They hadn't. The Monday after I'd hung up on my mother, I'd called an executive meeting with my investment team. "The Wellington Corp proposal," I'd said, sliding the thick folder across the conference table. "We're withdrawing from discussions. Send them a polite decline letter citing portfolio diversification concerns. No further explanation needed." My chief investment officer, Rebecca Torres, had raised an eyebrow. She knew better than to question my decisions outright, but I could see the curiosity in her expression. Wellington Corp was exactly the kind of mid-sized developer we typically invested in. "Any particular reason?" she'd asked carefully. "Personal conflict of interest," I'd replied, which was true enough. "The CEO is married to my sister, and I prefer to keep family relationships separate from business dealings." That had satisfied her, and the letter had gone out that afternoon. But ending discussions with Marcus was only the opening move. The real strategy required a partner, someone who could benefit from Wellington Corp's weakening position while advancing my own interests. Meridian Development had been on my radar for over a year. They were Wellington's biggest competitor in the luxury residential market, run by a sharp woman named Caroline Vance, who'd built her company from the ground up over 15 years. She was aggressive, smart, and hungry for the kind of capital injection that could let her dominate the market. I'd invited her to lunch at my office the following Wednesday, and she'd arrived precisely on time, dressed in a power suit that told me she understood this wasn't a casual meeting. "Ms. Hart," she'd said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. "I've been hoping for a chance to meet with you. Hart Capital's reputation in the industry is impressive." We'd sat in my private dining room, a space I reserved for important negotiations, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and lunch prepared by a private chef. I'd let her admire the view, let her feel the weight of power that came with sitting in this room before I'd gotten to business. "I'm interested in discussing a strategic partnership, Ms. Vance. A significant capital investment in Meridian Development, conditional on your company pursuing certain acquisition targets." Her eyes had sharpened with interest. "What kind of targets?" I'd pulled out a folder much thinner than the one Wellington had submitted, containing a list of 3 major projects currently contracted to Wellington Corp. The Riverside Luxury Towers, a waterfront development that Marcus had been working on for 2 years. The Harbor Plaza Commercial Complex, a mixed-use project in the newly gentrifying Harbor District. And the Westwood Estates, an exclusive suburban development targeting wealthy retirees. "These 3 projects," I'd said, sliding the folder across the table. "Wellington Corp is overextended. Their financing is shakier than it appears, and they're vulnerable to competitive pressure. I want you to make offers to these clients better terms than Wellington can match. Hart Capital will provide the backing you need to make those offers credible." Caroline had studied the list, and I'd seen the moment she understood what I was really offering. This wasn't just about 3 projects. This was about crippling her biggest competitor, about repositioning Meridian as the dominant player in the market. "Why?" she'd ask directly. "Why hand me this opportunity?" I'd appreciated her directness. Too many people in business danced around the real questions. "Let's just say I have reasons to want Wellington Corp's influence diminished. You'll benefit. I'll benefit, and the clients will get better terms and more reliable completion schedules. Everyone wins, except Marcus Wellington." She'd smiled then, a predator's smile that told me she knew exactly what she was looking at. "How much backing are we talking about?" I'd named a figure that made her blink. $45 million in credit facilities and direct investment, more than enough to fund aggressive acquisition attempts on all 3 projects, plus give her room to poach other Wellington clients if opportunities arose. "I'll need to see Wellington's financials to make competitive offers," she'd said. I'd pulled out another folder, this one considerably thicker. "Already compiled. My research team has been thorough." She'd paged through it, her expression growing more delighted with each page. "This is incredibly detailed. Some of this information isn't public." I'd simply smiled. "I have good researchers." We'd finalized the partnership agreement within a week, with contracts signed and money transferred by the end of month 1. Caroline had moved quickly after that, exactly as I'd anticipated. Her team had approached the Riverside developers with an offer that beat Wellington's bid by 12% and included guaranteed completion bonuses that Marcus couldn't match without destroying his profit margins. The developers had jumped at it, and Wellington Corp had received a contract termination notice with 30 days to clear the site. Harbor Plaza had been even easier. The commercial clients were already nervous about Wellington's timeline delays, and when Meridian had offered not just better terms but also a faster completion schedule backed by Hart Capital's reputation, the decision had been straightforward. Westwood Estates had required more finesse since Wellington was already 6 months into development, but Caroline had made an offer to buy out the entire project at a premium that let the original clients exit with profit, while giving Meridian control of the valuable suburban land. By the time month 1 ended, Marcus Wellington had lost 3 of his 5 major active projects, representing roughly 60% of his company's current revenue stream. I'd received regular updates from Caroline, who'd sent me brief emails with subject lines like, "Riverside acquired," and "Harbor Plaza signed." Each one a small confirmation that the plan was working exactly as designed. I was in my office reviewing another potential investment when Marcus Chen, my head of security, had called with an update from his surveillance of Wellington Corp. "Thought you'd want to know," he'd said, his tone suggesting he was trying not to laugh. Wellington's CFO just entered his office at high speed. Looked pretty agitated. "Our contact in their building says the word is they've lost another major contract." I'd thanked him and set down my phone, allowing myself a small smile. Everything was proceeding perfectly, each domino falling in sequence, and Marcus Wellington still had no idea what was happening or who was behind it. In his office across town, I imagined the scene unfolding. His CFO, a nervous man named Robert Chen, who'd been with Wellington Corp for 8 years, would have burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with panic and frustration. "Sir, we just lost the Riverside project, and the Harbor Plaza deal fell through. Someone's systematically poaching our clients. Do you have any enemies?" Marcus Wellington's deteriorating business situation took exactly 3 weeks to reach a crisis point that sent Chloe to my door. I'd been tracking the fallout through Caroline Vance's updates and my own intelligence network, watching Wellington Corp's stock price slide, reading the increasingly panicked trade publications, speculating about the company's stability, noting the departure of 2 senior executives who clearly saw the ship sinking and decided to abandon it before the final plunge. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Chloe would connect the dots between her husband's collapsing empire and her newly discovered billionaire sister. I suppose I'd underestimated how obvious the timing would seem to anyone paying attention, or perhaps I'd underestimated Chloe's intelligence, which was possible given how thoroughly I'd dismissed her for most of my life. Sarah buzzed me on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd month, her voice carrying a note of apology mixed with confusion. "Ms. Hart, your sister is here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent about seeing you. She says it's a family emergency." I glanced at my schedule, which showed a conference call starting in 20 minutes, and considered turning Chloe away. But curiosity won out. I wanted to see how she'd approach this, what arguments she'd marshal, whether she'd show any self-awareness about the absurdity of coming to me for help after a lifetime of treating me as beneath her notice. "Send her in," I said. But Sarah interrupted us in exactly 15 minutes, regardless of what's happening. "I have that call with the Singapore investors." Chloe swept into my office like she was making an entrance at a charity gala, all dramatic energy and barely controlled emotion. She'd dressed carefully for this visit, I noticed, wearing a designer outfit that probably cost $3,000, her hair and makeup perfect, despite the tears that I suspected were ready to flow on command. She looked around my office with wide eyes, taking in the custom furniture, the original artwork on the walls, the view that stretched for miles across the city. "So this is where you've been hiding," she said, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. Resentment, maybe, or fear, or both. "I haven't been hiding," I replied mildly, gesturing for her to sit in one of the chairs across from my desk. I didn't stand to greet her, didn't offer her anything to drink, didn't engage in any of the social niceties that would suggest this was a friendly visit between sisters. "I've been working. Please sit down, Chloe. I have limited time." She sat perching on the edge of the chair like she might need to leap up at any moment, and I watched her try to gather herself to organize whatever speech she'd prepared during her drive downtown. "Marcus is in trouble," she began, abandoning whatever preamble she'd planned and diving straight into the crisis. "His company is losing contracts. Major projects are falling through and no one can figure out why. But I know why, Evelyn. I know you're behind this." Her voice carried accusation, but also a desperate hope that I'd deny it, that there'd be some other explanation. I said nothing, simply watched her, waiting to see where she'd go next. "We're sisters," she continued, leaning forward, her eyes searching my face for any sign of softening. "I know we haven't always been close. I know things have been complicated, but we're still family. You can't just destroy my husband's business because you're angry about the wedding or whatever happened between us growing up." The appeal to family loyalty was predictable, the first card they all played when they wanted something from me. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "I haven't destroyed anything," I said calmly. "Wellington Corp is experiencing normal market competition. Other companies made better offers to his clients. That's how business works." Chloe's face flushed, and I saw the anger starting to break through her carefully maintained composure. "Don't play games with me, Evelyn. I know you're funding Meridian Development. I know you're the one backing all these aggressive buyouts. You're deliberately sabotaging Marcus, and you're doing it to hurt me." There it was, the shift from guilt to anger that I'd been expecting. I almost admired the speed of the transition. "Why would I want to hurt you?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd answer. "What have I ever done to you that would make you think I'd go out of my way to cause you pain?" She stood up abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. "You've always been jealous of me. Ever since we were kids, you resented that I was prettier, more successful, that our parents were proud of me. And now you have money, and you think that makes you better than me, but it doesn't. It just makes you vindictive and petty." The analysis was so divorced from reality, so completely self-centered in its interpretation of our history, that I almost laughed. She genuinely believed that I'd spent my entire life consumed with jealousy of her, unable to see that the person who'd been hurt, diminished, and cast aside hadn't been her, but me. "Chloe," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm simply making business decisions based on market analysis and investment strategy. Hart Capital partnered with Meridian because they're a solid company with good growth potential. If that partnership happens to affect Wellington Corp, that's unfortunate, but it's nothing personal." Nothing personal. The phrase hung in the air between us, and I saw her face twist with frustration at my refusal to engage with her emotional narrative. "How can you say it's not personal? You're destroying my marriage. Marcus is barely sleeping. He's stressed constantly, and we're hemorrhaging money. If this continues, we'll lose everything." Her voice had risen to nearly a shout, professional composure completely abandoned now. "You have to help us, Evelyn. You have to stop this. Call off whatever deal you have with Meridian. Give Marcus a chance to recover. Please." And there were the tears, right on schedule, welling up in her eyes and spilling down her carefully made-up cheeks. They looked real enough, I supposed, but I'd seen Chloe cry on command too many times as a child, using tears to get our parents' attention or avoid punishment to be moved by them now. "I'm not going to interfere with business partnerships based on family relationships," I said flatly. "That would be unethical and unprofessional. Wellington Corp needs to compete on its own merits, and if it can't, that's not my responsibility." Chloe stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like the concept that I might prioritize business ethics over family obligations was incomprehensible. "You've changed," she said finally, her voice dropping to something between a whisper and an accusation. "The Evelyn I knew would never be this cold, this cruel. Money has turned you into someone I don't recognize." I met her gaze steadily. "I haven't changed, Chloe. You just never bothered to know who I actually was." That seemed to break whatever final restraint she'd been holding on to. She stood, grabbed her designer purse, and headed for the door with quick, angry strides. But at the threshold, she turned back, her face contorted with rage and something that looked almost like desperation. "You're just a bitter security guard who got lucky," she screamed, her voice echoing in my office and probably carrying down the hallway. "Nobody really respects you. They're all just pretending because you have money now. But deep down, they know what you really are. A nobody. A failure who stumbled into success and thinks that makes her special." The words were meant to wound, to reduce me back to the invisible daughter sitting by the entrance at her wedding, but they landed with no force at all. I glanced at Sarah, who'd appeared in the doorway behind Chloe, her face shocked and concerned, clearly ready to call security if needed. I smiled slightly, not at Chloe, but at the futility of her attack, the desperation that drove someone to scream insults in a corporate office. "She'll learn soon enough," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough for both of them to hear, and turned back to my computer screen, dismissing Chloe as thoroughly as I'd been dismissed for 32 years. After Chloe's dramatic exit, I'd returned to work as if nothing had happened, though Sarah had hovered nervously for the rest of the day, clearly shaken by the confrontation. I'd assured her that family drama was nothing to worry about, and had proceeded with my conference call to Singapore as scheduled. The incident had confirmed what I already suspected my family would never understand. What they'd done to me would never see their treatment of me as anything other than justified by my supposed inadequacies. They'd rewritten history so thoroughly in their own minds that any attempt to make them acknowledge the truth would be futile. Which was fine. I didn't need their understanding. I just needed them to face consequences. By the third month after the wedding, Wellington Corp was in freefall. My family's phone calls had become increasingly frantic and less frequent as they realized I wouldn't respond, and I'd settled into a comfortable rhythm of watching everything unfold according to plan. Then the invitation arrived, delivered by courier in a heavy cream envelope with elegant calligraphy addressing it to Ms. Evelyn Hart, CEO, Hart Capital Group. I'd opened it at my desk, sliding out the thick cardstock invitation that announced the annual Metropolitan Charity Gala scheduled for the last Saturday of the month. The event was legendary in our city's social circles, a black tie affair that brought together politicians, business leaders, philanthropists, and old money families for an evening of networking disguised as charitable giving. I'd attended twice before in my capacity as CEO, both times maintaining my careful anonymity by arriving late, leaving early, and avoiding the photographers who documented every detail for the society pages. But this year's invitation was different. Attached to it was a personal note from the gala committee chair, Margaret Ashford, a woman whose family had been founding members of nearly every important social institution in the city for 3 generations. "Ms. Hart," the note read in her distinctive handwriting, "we would be honored if you would consider being our keynote speaker this year. Your work empowering underrepresented entrepreneurs aligns perfectly with our mission, and we believe your story would inspire our donors. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss details." I'd set the invitation down and stared at it for a long moment, understanding immediately what accepting would mean. There would be no anonymity at this event, no slipping in and out unnoticed. The keynote speaker was the centerpiece of the evening, introduced, formally photographed, extensively expected to give a substantial speech before an audience of over 800 people. Everyone who mattered in this city would be there, including, I realized with a flutter of anticipation in my chest, my family. The Harts had been attending the Metropolitan Charity Gala for 15 years, ever since my father's small business had grown successful enough to justify the $5,000 per couple ticket price. It was the event where they'd networked, made connections, and established themselves as part of the city's upper-middle-class social fabric. That evening, I'd driven to Victoria's estate, a sprawling property in the hills overlooking the city that she'd bought 20 years ago when her company had gone public. She'd welcomed me into her study, a warm room lined with books and comfortable leather furniture, and poured us both glasses of excellent scotch before settling into her favorite chair. I'd shown her the invitation and Margaret Ashford's note, and she'd read them both carefully before looking up at me with eyes that saw everything I wasn't saying. "You're considering accepting," she'd said. It wasn't a question. "I am," I'd admitted. "But it means going fully public. No more Hart, no more avoiding photographers, no more careful anonymity. Everyone will know exactly who I am." Victoria had smiled, that warm expression that always made me feel like I was making the right choice even when I was terrified. "Evelyn, you've been hiding for 5 years. You built an empire in the shadows because you needed to prove to yourself that you could do it without anyone's preconceptions helping or hindering you. But you've proved that now. Hart Capital Group is successful because of your vision and your work, not because of your name or your connections or anything other than merit. She'd leaned forward, her scotch glass cradled in both hands, her expression serious. The question is, are you ready to stop hiding? Because once you step into that spotlight, there's no going back. Your family will know, yes, but so will everyone else. You'll be scrutinized, photographed, written about. People will have opinions about you, some fair, most not. You'll lose the privacy you've carefully maintained. I'd thought about what it would mean to be publicly identified as the CEO who'd built a $2 billion investment firm before age 33 to have my face in business magazines and my opinions quoted in financial news. It's time, I'd said finally. No more hiding. Let them see who I really are. Victoria had raised her glass in a toast. Then accept the invitation and give them a speech they'll never forget. Show them that the girl they underestimated became the woman they now need. I'd clinked my glass against hers and felt something settle in my chest, a sense of rightness about the decision. The next day I'd called Margaret Ashford and accepted the speaking invitation, working with her team over the following 2 weeks to finalize the details. The speech topic would be Investing in the Underestimated, How Supporting Overlooked Talent Creates Both Profit and Progress. The committee had loved it, seeing it as perfectly aligned with their philanthropic mission, not knowing that for me the topic was deeply personal. The programs had been printed a week before the event, elegant booklets listing the evening's schedule, the menu, the list of major donors, and prominently on the front page, the keynote speaker announcement. I'd received my copy and studied it, seeing my professional identity laid out in black and white, for the first time in a context my family would encounter. Keynote address by E. Hart, CEO, Hart Capital Group, Investing in the Underestimated. Below that was a brief biography that mentioned Hart Capital's $2 billion portfolio, my work supporting women and minority entrepreneurs, and my role advising on national economic policy. I'd learned through Marcus Chen's intelligence network that my parents had received their gala invitations 3 weeks prior and had already purchased their tickets, excited to attend the city's premier social event, as they did every year. Chloe and Marcus had also planned to attend before Wellington Corp's financial situation had deteriorated, but they'd recently sold their tickets, unable to justify the expense given their mounting debts. It would be just my parents then, dressed in their finest, ready to network, and see and be seen by the people they considered their peers. They'd arrive expecting the usual evening of champagne speeches by philanthropists they barely knew, and opportunities to discuss their successful daughter Chloe with anyone who'd listen. What they wouldn't expect, what they couldn't possibly anticipate, was opening their programs and seeing that name. E. Hart. The same name that Chloe had discovered on Hart Capital Group's incorporation documents. The same name that had been systematically destroying Marcus Wellington's business empire, the same name that had been ignoring their desperate phone calls for 3 months. My father would open that program in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, surrounded by 800 of the city's most influential people, and he would freeze his champagne glass halfway to his lips as his brain tried to process what his eyes were seeing. E. Hart, he would say, his voice barely audible. That's the same name as... But he wouldn't be able to finish the sentence, because finishing it would mean accepting a reality he'd spent 3 months trying to deny. I'd arrived at the Riverside Hotel 2 hours before the gala was scheduled to begin, using the private entrance that Margaret Ashford had arranged for keynote speakers. My stylist had spent 3 hours transforming me that afternoon, and the woman who looked back at me from the mirror in the hotel's VIP preparation room was someone I barely recognized. The gown was a custom Valentino in deep emerald silk that moved like water, fitted perfectly to emphasize the figure I'd earned through years of disciplined gym sessions that my family had never witnessed. My hair was swept up in an intricate style that showcased diamond earrings Victoria had insisted on lending me, and my makeup was flawless, highlighting features I'd spent my childhood being told weren't pretty enough to matter. Victoria had arrived shortly after me, dressed in her signature elegant style, and she'd circled me slowly, nodding with satisfaction. "You look like power personified," she'd said simply. "Are you nervous?" I'd checked my reflection one more time, adjusting an earring that didn't need adjusting. "Terrified," I'd admitted. "But ready." She'd squeezed my hand and we'd gone over my speech one final time, though I'd memorized every word weeks ago. The theme was professional focused on investment strategy and social impact, but woven throughout were personal truths that anyone paying attention would recognize as autobiography disguised as business philosophy. In the grand ballroom, my parents had arrived right on schedule according to the text updates Marcus Chen was sending me from his position among the security staff. He'd described them entering in their formal wear, my mother in a gown that was expensive but not quite haute couture, my father in a tuxedo rental that fit reasonably well. They'd been greeted by acquaintances, had accepted champagne from passing waiters, and had moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who'd attended enough of these events to feel comfortable, if not quite belonging. I'd asked Marcus specifically whether they'd opened their programs yet, and he'd confirmed that my father had, and that the color had drained from his face so dramatically that my mother had asked if he was feeling ill. What surprised me was learning that Chloe had come after all, apparently having borrowed money from our parents, to purchase a last-minute ticket. She'd arrived separately from them, probably not wanting to explain why Marcus wasn't with her, and had positioned herself near the back of the ballroom where she could observe without being too visible. I wondered if she'd come hoping to confront me, or if she simply couldn't resist attending the city's most prestigious social event despite her financial situation. Either way, having all three of them present made this moment even more perfect than I'd anticipated. The gala proceeded with the standard rhythm of such events. Cocktails and networking, then dinner served at elaborately decorated tables while a string quartet played softly in the background. I'd remained in the VIP area, as speakers traditionally did, watching the crowd through a discreet monitor while finishing my own meal and reviewing my notes one final time. I could see my parents at their table, both looking shell-shocked, speaking to each other in what appeared to be urgent whispers while barely touching their food. The people seated with them kept trying to engage them in conversation, clearly confused by their distraction. Finally, after dessert had been cleared and coffee served, Margaret Ashford took the stage. She was a commanding presence, even at 70, her white hair perfectly coiffed, her voice carrying authority, earned through decades of leading charitable organizations. She spoke briefly about the gala's mission, thanked the major donors, and then her tone shifted to something warmer, more personal. "Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from one of the most remarkable business leaders of this generation. She's built a $2 billion investment firm before the age of 33, focusing specifically on supporting entrepreneurs that traditional investors overlook. Her work has created thousands of jobs, launched hundreds of successful companies, and proven that investing in underestimated talent isn't just morally right, it's incredibly profitable." I stood in the wings, my heart pounding, watching the audience's attention focus entirely on Margaret. She's advised 3 senators on economic policy, sits on the boards of 5 major corporations, and has been called the future of ethical investing by the Wall Street Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, CEO Evelyn Hart of Hart Capital Group. The applause began before I even stepped onto the stage, and as I walked into the spotlight, it grew. The ballroom held 800 people, and it seemed like every single one of them was on their feet, clapping, some even cheering. The standing ovation rolled through the room in waves, and I stood at the podium overwhelmed despite having prepared for this moment, letting it wash over me. Then Congresswoman Patricia Reeves stood from her table near the front, her voice cutting through the applause. "Before Ms. Hart begins, I want to publicly thank her. Without her investment and guidance, the National Infrastructure Renewal Project would never have gotten off the ground. Evelyn Hart didn't just provide capital, she provided vision and courage when no one else would. This country owes her a debt of gratitude." The applause intensified, and I saw faces throughout the crowd, nodding, people turning to their neighbors to whisper about what they were witnessing. I gripped the podium and began to speak, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Thank you for that generous introduction. I want to talk tonight about a topic that's both professional and deeply personal to me: the extraordinary value of investing in people that others have written off as insufficient. I'd launched into the speech describing case studies of companies Hart Capital had funded entrepreneurs who'd been rejected by every traditional investor because they didn't fit the expected mold. I spoke about a woman who'd been told she was too old to start a tech company at 45 and had built a $50 million enterprise. I described a young man from a poor neighborhood who'd been dismissed as uneducated despite having taught himself advanced programming and was now employing 200 people. The common thread in all these stories, I said, my eyes scanning the crowd, is that someone somewhere decided these individuals weren't worth the investment. Someone looked at them and saw limitations instead of potential. Someone made a judgment based on superficial criteria rather than actual capability. My gaze had been moving systematically through the audience, and then I found them. My parents sat at table 47, roughly in the middle of the room, and they were the only two people still seated. Everyone around them was standing applauding at various points in my speech, but Ray and Judith Hart remained frozen in their chairs, their faces drained of color, looking at me with expressions that mixed shock, fear, and something that might have been belated understanding, while 800 people stood and celebrated the daughter they'd spent 32 years telling wasn't good enough. I'd finished my speech to thunderous applause, accepted congratulations from dozens of influential people who wanted to shake my hand and exchange business cards, and maintained perfect composure through it all, even as I watched my parents slip out of the ballroom before the event officially ended, unable to face the social consequences of having publicly dismissed a daughter who'd just been celebrated by the city's elite. The triumph had been everything I'd anticipated, sweeter even than I'd imagined. But by the time I returned to my penthouse near midnight, exhaustion had replaced adrenaline, and I wanted nothing more than to remove the elaborate gown wash off the makeup and process everything that had happened. Marcus Chen was waiting in my lobby, which was unusual enough that I felt a spike of concern before I'd even reached him. My head of security didn't typically appear at my residence without advance notice, unless something significant had developed. He stood as I approached, holding a manila folder that looked thick with documents, his expression grave in a way that suggested whatever was inside had disturbed him. "Ms. Hart," he said, his voice low and professional. "I apologize for the late hour, but I thought you'd want to see this immediately. We uncovered something during our routine monitoring of Marcus Wellington's communications that changes the entire picture." I'd invited him up to my penthouse, poured us both coffee, despite the hour, and sat down to review whatever had prompted this midnight visit. Marcus set the folder on my glass coffee table and opened it carefully, revealing a stack of photographs that had been printed on high-quality paper. "These are from approximately 14 months ago," he explained, pointing to the date stamp in the corner of the first image. "We were reviewing archived surveillance footage from various locations around the city, cross-referencing with Wellington's movements when we found these." The first photograph showed Marcus Wellington sitting in a coffee shop I recognized as being downtown, across the table from a man I didn't know. Both men were leaning forward in conversation, and there were documents spread between them on the small table. The angle suggested the photo had been taken from security camera footage, slightly grainy, but clear enough to identify faces and read some of the text on the papers. "The man he's meeting is Dennis Crawford," Marcus explained. "He's a private investigator, not particularly high-end but thorough. The kind someone hires when they want information but don't want to leave an obvious trail through more reputable firms." I studied the photograph more closely, and my stomach tightened as I made out the header on one of the documents visible in the image. "Evelyn Hart, Background Investigation," it read, followed by what looked like a detailed report. I flipped to the next photograph, which showed another angle of the same meeting, this one capturing Marcus pointing at a specific section of the report while Crawford took notes. 14 months ago, I said slowly, my mind working through the timeline. That's 2 months before Marcus met Chloe at that charity auction, before they started dating. Exactly. Marcus confirmed his tone, suggesting he'd already drawn the same conclusions I was racing toward. We pulled Crawford's records, required a few favors and some creative legal maneuvering, but we got them. Wellington hired him to conduct a comprehensive background check on you 13 months before he married your sister. He wanted to know everything: your education, your work history, your assets, your business connections. He pulled out another document, this one a printout of what looked like an investigative report. Crawford discovered that E. Hart, CEO of Hart Capital Group, was actually Evelyn Hart, daughter of Raymond and Judith Hart. He traced your connection to Victoria Chen, documented your rise through the venture capital world, estimated your personal net worth at approximately $80 million, separate from your company holdings. The implications crashed over me like cold water. Marcus Wellington hadn't stumbled into my family by chance. He hadn't met Chloe randomly at a charity event and fallen in love with her beauty and charm. He'd researched me, identified me as a target, and then deliberately pursued my sister as a means of access. He knew, I whispered, staring at the photographs. He knew exactly who I was before he ever spoke to Chloe. Marcus nodded grimly. It gets worse. We managed to access his email archives again through means I'd prefer not to detail, and found correspondence with his business partner David Kellerman from around the same time. He handed me a printed email, and I read it with growing horror and rage. The message was dated 13 months ago, sent at 11 at night, clearly written, after several drinks based on the casual tone. Dave, it read, I think I've found the perfect way to secure Hart Capital funding for the Harbor Plaza project. Remember that billionaire CEO we heard about, the one who keeps her identity secret? E. Hart. Turns out she's local, and I've got her full background now. She's got family, including a sister who's exactly the kind of social climber who'd be easy to impress. Here's my play. I court the sister, marry into the family, and use the family connection to pressure E. Hart into investing. The sister is an idiot, from what I can tell, completely superficial, perfect target. She'll never suspect I'm using her to get to her sister, and once I'm family, Hart will have to at least consider our proposals seriously. It's genius, right? Mixing business with pleasure, and the pleasure part won't even be that much of a sacrifice since the sister is hot even if she's dumb as rocks. I read the email 3 times each reading, making my hands shake more violently with fury. Marcus Wellington had calculated every step of his relationship with Chloe, had evaluated her as a tool to be used, had married her under completely false pretenses, with the sole intention of manipulating me into funding his projects. The cruelty of it was staggering, not just to me, but to Chloe, who, for all her faults, had genuinely believed someone loved her. There's more, Marcus said quietly, pulling out additional emails. He bragged to Kellerman about how easy Chloe was to manipulate, how he'd figured out exactly what compliments to give her, which restaurants to take her to, how to make her feel like she was the center of his world. He called it playing the long game, and said the investment in a wedding ring would pay off tenfold once he had access to Hart Capital. I set down the email, my mind reeling with the implications. Every interaction I'd had with Marcus Wellington needed to be reevaluated through this new lens. His presence at the wedding, his behavior toward me, his company's aggressive pursuit of Hart Capital investment, even the way he'd looked at me at the gala with that calculating expression. He hadn't been surprised to learn who I was, because he'd known all along. The whole thing had been an elaborate con, and both Chloe and I had been marks, though in very different ways. How long has he known that I was deliberately destroying his company? I asked. Marcus hesitated before answering. Based on our analysis of his recent communications, we think he figured it out about 3 weeks ago. But here's what's interesting. He hasn't told Chloe the full truth. She still doesn't know he married her specifically to get to you. She thinks he loves her, or at least she did until recently. I stood and walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights, while my thoughts churned. The satisfaction I'd felt from tonight's gala had evaporated, replaced by cold calculation about what to do with this information. Marcus Wellington wasn't just a casualty of my revenge against my family. He was the architect of his own downfall, a manipulator who'd used my sister as a pawn in a scheme to exploit me. The email's final line burned in my memory, his casual dismissal of Chloe as someone too stupid to recognize she was being used. Found the perfect way to secure Hart Capital funding, marry into the family. The sister is an idiot. She'll never suspect. The revelation about Marcus Wellington's calculated manipulation had consumed my thoughts for 2 days after Marcus Chen delivered that folder. I'd barely slept, alternating between fury at the audacity of his scheme and a cold satisfaction that my systematic destruction of his company was even more justified than I'd realized. But on the 3rd day, David Weinstein called with news that temporarily displaced my obsession with Marcus's betrayal. "Ms. Hart," he'd said, his voice carrying the careful formality he used when delivering significant legal information. "I've completed my investigation into your grandparents' estate. I need to meet with you as soon as possible. There are documents you need to see, and some of them are time-sensitive in nature." We'd arranged to meet at his office that afternoon, a suite in one of the older downtown buildings that radiated quiet, expensive competence. David was in his late 60s, a man who'd spent 4 decades specializing in estate law and had seen every variation of family betrayal that money could inspire. He'd greeted me with his usual understated professionalism, but I'd noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to a safe in the corner of his office. "Before we discuss the findings," he'd said, pulling a leather portfolio from his desk, "there's something your grandparents left with me personally. I was instructed to hold it until you turned 30 and only to release it to you directly, not through any intermediaries." He'd walked to the safe, input a combination, and withdrew a cream-colored envelope that looked like it had been sitting untouched for years. The paper was thick and expensive, and across the front in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting were the words, "To be opened only by Evelyn Hart." My hands had trembled slightly as I took it from David, feeling the weight of it, knowing that whatever was inside had been important enough for my grandmother to seal away with specific instructions. "She gave this to me 7 years ago," David had explained quietly. 2 months before she passed. She made me promise I would deliver it exactly as she specified. I've kept that promise. I'd opened the envelope carefully, sliding out several sheets of stationery that bore my grandmother's monogram at the top. Her handwriting covered both sides of each page, the script slightly shaky but still legible, written by someone who knew her time was limited and wanted to make every word count. "My dearest Evelyn," it began, and I'd had to pause, my vision blurring with unexpected tears. My grandmother had been the one person in my family who'd consistently shown me affection, who'd told me I was smart and capable, who'd seen value in me that my parents couldn't recognize. Losing her had been devastating, and reading her words now, years after her death, brought that grief rushing back. If you're reading this, it means you've turned 30 and David has given you this letter as instructed. I'm writing this in the spring of your 25th year, and I have perhaps 6 months left based on what the doctors tell me. Your grandfather and I have been discussing our estate planning extensively, and we want you to understand the decisions we've made and why. I'd settled into one of David's leather chairs, reading, slowly absorbing every word. "We know that Ray and Judith favor Chloe. We've watched them do it your entire life, and it breaks our hearts. Your mother was treated the same way by her own mother, and despite promising herself she'd be different, she's repeating the pattern with you. We've tried to intervene, tried to make them see what they're doing to you, but parents rarely listen to their parents about how to raise children." The letter continued, explaining that my grandparents had accumulated substantial assets over their lifetimes. Their home investment accounts, life insurance policies, and various other holdings totaled approximately $6 million. "We've structured our will very specifically," my grandmother had written. 70% of our estate will go to you, Evelyn. 30% will go to Chloe. But there are conditions for your inheritance that we've built in, and they're important. You will not receive your portion until you turn 30 years old, and have demonstrated that you can build a successful life without relying on family money. We're not doing this to be cruel, sweetheart. We're doing this to protect you. I'd read that paragraph 3 times, trying to understand the logic. My grandmother had anticipated my confusion because she'd explained further. "If we simply gave you money at our death, your parents would find a way to take it from you or pressure you into giving it to Chloe. More importantly, we want you to prove to yourself that you're capable and valuable without anyone's financial help. Money given too easily can become a crutch, but money earned through your own efforts becomes a foundation. If you can succeed on your own by age 30, then you'll know with absolute certainty that you never needed their approval or their support. You'll be unshakable in your sense of self-worth. The letter had concluded with expressions of love and confidence in my future, and I'd sat there holding those pages crying silently while David waited with patient sympathy. My grandmother had seen everything, had understood the dynamics that were destroying me, and had tried to create a safety net that would empower rather than enable me. But according to the documents David had uncovered, I'd never received that inheritance. The official probate records showed that my grandparents' estate had been valued at only $60,000, split equally between Chloe and me. I'd received $30,000 when I was 27, 3 years after their deaths, and I'd accepted it without question because I'd been too busy building my company to investigate further. David had spread out 2 sets of documents on his desk side by side. "This," he'd said, pointing to the left set, "is the original will that your grandparents filed with me and with the probate court. It clearly states the 70-30 split and the conditions for your inheritance. This," he'd pointed to the right set, "is the will that was actually probated and executed. Someone created a fraudulent version that drastically undervalued the estate and split it equally. They forged your grandparents' signatures, and my notary stamp then submitted it to the court after your grandmother passed." I'd examined both documents, seeing the subtle differences in paper quality, the slight variations in signature style that only an expert would catch, the timestamps that didn't align with the original filing dates. "My parents did this," I'd said, not a question but a statement. David had nodded. "The evidence strongly suggests that Ray and Judith Hart were responsible for the forgery. They had motive, means, and opportunity. They were the executors of the estate, which gave them access to all the necessary documents and the ability to control what got filed with the court." The numbers David had calculated were staggering. The actual value of my grandparents' estate at the time of probate had been $6.2 million. 70% of that was $4.34 million. Minus the $30,000 I'd actually received, my parents had stolen $4.3 million that my grandparents had intended for me. They'd used it to fund their lifestyle, to pay for Chloe's expensive wedding, to maintain the country club memberships and luxury cars and all the trappings of success that they'd displayed so proudly. And they'd done it by committing fraud, by forging legal documents, by betraying not just me, but my grandparents' explicit final wishes. David had been watching me process this information, his expression sympathetic but professional. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but clear. "The falsified will is a felony, Ms. Hart. Document forgery, fraud, theft by deception. Your parents could face prison time, potentially 5 to 10 years, depending on how aggressively the district attorney decided to pursue charges. You would be well within your rights to report this to law enforcement immediately." He'd paused, letting that sink in, then added, "Of course you have other options as well." I'd stared at the documents spread across his desk, my hands trembling as I picked up the fraudulent will and examined my grandparents' forged signatures. $4.3 million. Years of my life. My grandparents' love and faith in me. All stolen by the people who were supposed to protect me. Or I could use this as leverage. I'd said slowly, my mind already calculating the possibilities, seeing how this piece fit into the larger chess game I'd been playing for months. The decision to use the forged will as leverage, rather than immediately reporting it to law enforcement, meant I needed to understand my parents more completely, to anticipate their reactions and weaknesses, before I confronted them with evidence of their crime. David Weinstein had given me copies of all the documentation, but I wanted more context, more ammunition. So 3 days after that meeting in his office, I'd done something I hadn't done in over a decade. I'd gone to my parents' house while they were out. Marcus Chen had made it simple, providing me with their schedule based on social media posts and calendar surveillance. They were attending a fundraising luncheon at the country club, an event that would keep them occupied for at least 3 hours. I'd let myself in using the spare key that had been hidden in the same fake rock by the garden for 20 years, and stepped into the home where I'd grown up feeling invisible. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I'd simply grown larger in my sense of self. Everything was meticulously maintained, decorated in the style my mother had always favored, traditional and expensive and carefully curated to impress visitors. I'd moved through the rooms, methodically photographing financial documents I found in my father's office, noting the luxury purchases that had been funded by stolen inheritance money, building a comprehensive picture of how they'd spent what should have been mine. But it was in my mother's study, a small room off the master bedroom, that she used for managing household affairs and her various social committee responsibilities, that I'd found something I hadn't expected. On a shelf behind some photo albums pushed back and clearly untouched for years was a stack of old journals with worn leather covers. I'd pulled them out without really thinking about it, more curious than purposeful, and opened the first one. The handwriting was my mother's, but younger, less controlled, the script of someone writing quickly to purge thoughts rather than create something to be read by others. The first entry was dated 36 years ago when my mother would have been 16. Sarah got asked to the spring dance by Tommy Henderson. It read, "Mama spent an hour telling me how beautiful Sarah looked in her new dress, how lucky she was to be so naturally pretty." Then she looked at me and said, "Well, Judith, not everyone can be the belle of the ball. You'll find someone eventually who appreciates a plain girl." I'd stood there in my mother's study, holding a journal that should have remained private, and felt something crack in my chest. The entry continued with my teenage mother's pain, her description of watching her younger sister receive all their mother's pride and attention, while she was dismissed as the less attractive, less interesting daughter. I'd told myself I should put the journal back, that reading someone's private thoughts was an invasion I had no right to commit. But I couldn't stop. I'd sat down on the floor and started reading systematically, working through years of my mother's documented suffering. Entry after entry revealed a pattern that was sickeningly familiar. At 17, my mother had written, "Mama said I'm not as pretty as Sarah, so I don't need college. She says I should focus on finding a husband who won't mind a plain wife, someone who values practical skills. Sarah is going to State University in the fall. I'm supposed to stay home and help Mama with the house. I hate myself. I hate being invisible. I hate that no matter what I do, I'm always going to be the disappointing daughter." The words could have been ripped from my own teenage diary, the same pain expressed in almost identical language across 2 generations. At 19, my mother had written about watching Sarah get engaged to a wealthy man while their mother threw an elaborate party, then mentioned casually to Judith that she should be grateful anyone would want to marry her eventually. At 21, an entry described Sarah's wedding where my mother had been a bridesmaid, but felt like a servant organizing details while everyone fawned over the bride. At 23, my mother had met my father and her entries had become briefly hopeful. "Ray doesn't compare me to Sarah. He sees me. He chose me. Maybe I can finally be someone's first choice instead of their consolation prize." But even after marriage, the comparisons had continued from my grandmother. Entries from my mother's mid-20s described family gatherings where Sarah's accomplishments were celebrated while Judith's life was dismissed as ordinary. My grandmother had apparently told people at parties that she had 2 daughters, 1 beautiful and 1 useful, positioning my mother as the practical sister who'd never quite measured up to Sarah's glamour. Reading these entries, I'd felt an unwanted sympathy beginning to form a recognition that my mother had been wounded in the same way she'd later wounded me. The later journals documented my mother's first pregnancy with Chloe, and the determination that things would be different for her daughters. "I won't do to my children what Mama did to me," she'd written when Chloe was born. "I'll love them equally. I'll make sure neither feels less than the other." But then I'd found the journals from after my own birth 2 years after Chloe and watched the promises begin to erode. The entries became shorter, more perfunctory, but what was there revealed my mother's internal struggle with her own trauma and how it manifested in her parenting. When Chloe was 4 and I was 2, my mother had written, "Chloe is so beautiful. Everyone comments on it. She looks like Sarah did at that age, and when I see her, I feel proud but also afraid. I don't want her to become Sarah, to have everything come easily because of her looks. But I also don't want her to suffer like I did. When I look at Evelyn, I see myself. Plain, ordinary. The one who will have to work harder because she doesn't have natural advantages. I want to prepare her for that reality, to toughen her up so the world won't hurt her like it hurt me. But how do I do that without making her feel what I felt? The answer apparently had been to repeat exactly what had been done to her, despite recognizing the damage it caused. Later entries showed my mother convincing herself that treating Chloe as special was protecting her from becoming too arrogant, and treating me as less was preparing me for a harsh world. The rationalizations were elaborate and ultimately hollow ways of justifying behavior that she must have known on some level was destructive. I'd found the entry written the day I'd been denied the scholarship to London, my mother's handwriting reflecting her own internal conflict. Evelyn was upset about the scholarship. Ray thinks we made the right decision, that girls don't need that kind of education. But I remember when Mama wouldn't let me go to college, how much it hurt. Am I doing the same thing to Evelyn that was done to me? But Chloe needs opportunities too, and we can't afford both. Someone has to sacrifice. The final entry I'd read, the one that had broken something inside me, was written 32 years ago, the day I'd been born. My mother's handwriting was shaky, probably written while exhausted from labor, but the words were clear. I held my daughter today and made a promise I'll never make her feel worthless like Mama made me feel. I'll be different. I'll be the mother I needed and never had. This baby girl will know she's valued, that she's loved, that she's enough exactly as she is. I'll break this cycle. I swear I will. I'd closed the journal and sat there on the floor of my mother's study, tears running down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. But you weren't different, Mom. I'd whispered to the empty room, my voice breaking. You became exactly like her. Understanding my mother's pain didn't erase what she'd done to me, but it shifted something in my perspective, made the situation more complex and tragic than I'd allowed myself to see. I'd left her house that day with copies of financial documents and a weight in my chest that hadn't been there before. But complexity and tragedy didn't change the fact that Marcus Wellington had deliberately manipulated my entire family, that he'd calculated every step of his relationship with Chloe for financial gain, and that he'd committed actual crimes in the process of building his real estate empire. Understanding my mother's trauma might eventually influence how I dealt with her, but Marcus Wellington deserved no such consideration. I'd spent the following week working with David Weinstein and a forensic accountant. He'd recommended a sharp woman named Rita Chen, who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. We'd compiled everything Marcus Chen's security team had gathered about Marcus Wellington's business dealings, cross-referenced it with public records, and built an airtight case documenting multiple instances of fraud, money laundering, and contract falsification. Wellington Corp had been cooking its books for at least 3 years, inflating property values to secure larger loans, hiding cost overruns from investors, and moving money through shell companies to avoid taxes and obscure the true financial state of various projects. The evidence was damning enough that Rita had looked up from her analysis and said bluntly, "This man is going to prison. The only question is for how long?" I'd asked her to prepare 2 packages of documentation, one for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and one for the Securities and Exchange Commission, both anonymous but comprehensive enough that investigators would have everything they needed to build a case. David had handled the actual submission through channels that protected my identity, using a secure drop system that lawyers sometimes employed for whistleblower situations. The packages had been delivered on a Monday morning in the 5th month, and I'd waited to see how quickly federal investigators would move. The answer was remarkably fast. By Wednesday afternoon, I'd received a text from Marcus Chen with a single word, "happening." I'd turned on the television in my office just as the local news interrupted regular programming with breaking coverage. The screen showed a line of black SUVs pulling up to Wellington Corp's downtown office building. Federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI streaming out and entering through the main doors. The news anchor's voice was breathless with excitement as she described what appeared to be a major federal raid on one of the city's prominent real estate development companies. I'd watched the coverage with a sense of detachment, seeing Wellington Corp employees being escorted out of the building boxes of documents being loaded into vehicles, the company's offices being systematically searched and documented. The news had moved to a split screen showing the office raid on one side, and on the other, federal agents arriving at a large house in an exclusive suburb that I recognized as Marcus and Chloe's residence. My sister had answered the door in workout clothes, clearly confused, and the cameras had captured her face transforming from bewilderment to horror, as agents presented a warrant and moved past her into the house. Then Marcus had appeared, being led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, and his usually perfect hair disheveled. The image of him being placed in the back of a federal vehicle while news helicopters circled overhead had been broadcast live across every local channel and quickly picked up by national news networks. I'd watched him duck his head as agents guided him into the car, watched Chloe standing in the doorway of their house looking lost and broken, and felt absolutely nothing. This was just as cold and impersonal, the natural consequence of his decisions finally catching up to him. The evening news had led with the story, and I'd watched from home as reporters pieced together what they knew. "Real estate mogul arrested for fraud," read the chyron across the bottom of the screen. The anchor detailed the charges: wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud investors. The list went on, each charge carrying potential prison time that added up to decades. Then came the detail that interested me most. Wellington's wife, Chloe Hart Wellington, was not arrested. Sources close to the investigation say she appears to have been unaware of her husband's illegal activities and is not currently considered a suspect. I'd wondered how long it would take for Chloe to learn the full truth, not just about Marcus's crimes, but about why he'd married her in the first place. Marcus Chen had maintained surveillance on the federal holding facility where Marcus Wellington had been taken, and late that night he'd sent me an audio file with a note: "Thought you'd want to hear this. He used his one phone call to contact your sister. We intercepted it legally through our law enforcement contacts." I'd hesitated before opening the file, knowing that whatever was on it would be painful, but curiosity and a sense of completeness had won out. The audio quality was clear, picked up through the facility's recording system that monitored all inmate calls. I'd heard the automated message announcing that this was a call from a federal detention center. Then Marcus's voice, tight with anger and stress. "Chloe, I need you to listen carefully. I need you to call my attorney, David Kellerman, and tell him to get down here immediately. And I need you to liquidate whatever assets you can access. We're going to need money for bail and legal fees." Chloe's voice had been thick with tears breaking on almost every word. "Marcus, what's happening? The news is saying you stole millions of dollars, that you've been committing fraud for years. They're saying our house might be seized, that everything we have might be evidence. I don't understand any of this." There had been a long pause, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed, the careful charm he'd always used with her completely stripped away, leaving only contempt and bitterness. "You think I care about you," he'd said, and I'd heard Chloe's sharp intake of breath through the recording. "You think I married you because I loved you. I married you to get to your sister, to get access to Hart Capital's money. I researched Evelyn for months, figured out the perfect angle, and you were it. The beautiful, stupid sister who'd be so flattered by attention from a successful man that she'd never question why I was really interested." His laugh was bitter, empty of any warmth. "Turns out the stupid one in the family was me. I should have known better than to go after someone like Evelyn Hart. She's been 10 steps ahead this entire time, and I walked right into her trap. But you were exactly as easy to manipulate as I thought you'd be. Congratulations, Chloe. You married a con artist and you never even suspected." The recording of Marcus's phone call had ended with the sound of Chloe sobbing and the line going dead. I'd sat in the darkness of my penthouse listening to that audio file 3 times each replay, making me feel less victorious and more unsettled. Marcus Wellington was getting exactly what he deserved, but Chloe hadn't known about his scheme. She genuinely believed someone loved her, had built her life around that belief, and was now discovering that the foundation had been rotten from the start. I'd expected to feel satisfaction at her pain, some sense of cosmic justice being served, but instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion mixed with an emotion I didn't want to examine too closely. Sarah called me at work 2 days after Marcus's arrest, her voice carrying that particular tension she used when delivering news she knew I wouldn't like. "Ms. Hart, your sister is in the lobby. She doesn't have an appointment, and I told her you're in meetings all afternoon, but she's insisting she needs to see you. She's quite distraught." I'd glanced at my calendar, which was indeed full of legitimate meetings, and considered having security escort Chloe out. But something in Sarah's tone, a note of genuine concern rather than irritation, made me reconsider. "Give me 10 minutes to wrap up this call, then send her up." When Chloe walked into my office, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who'd screamed at me weeks ago about being a lucky security guard had been polished and put together, despite her anger still maintaining the glossy exterior that had been her armor her entire life. The person who stood in my doorway now looked like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of makeup except for the mascara that had run down her cheeks in dark streaks she hadn't bothered to wipe away. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater clothing I'd never seen her in before, as if she'd grabbed whatever was closest without caring how she looked. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she was holding herself like someone who might shatter if touched. She didn't wait for me to invite her to sit. She sank into one of the chairs across from my desk and stared at her hands, which were twisting together in her lap. "I heard the recording," she said, her voice hoarse and raw. "Marcus's attorney played it for me yesterday. He thought I should know what Marcus said about me, about us, about why he married me. He said I needed to understand that Marcus might try to use me as a scapegoat for his crimes, that I should be prepared." She looked up at me then, and the devastation in her eyes was so complete that I had to look away. "Did you know, before you started destroying his company? Did you know he'd only married me to get to you?" I'd considered lying, softening the truth, but we were past that now. "I found out about a month ago. My security team uncovered the background check he'd done on me before he ever met you and the emails where he bragged to his business partner about his plan." Chloe made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "A month? You've known for a month that my entire marriage was a lie and you didn't tell me." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered with the flatness of someone too exhausted for anger. "Would you have believed me if I had?" I asked quietly. She thought about that, then shook her head. "No, I would have thought you were trying to sabotage my happiness because you were jealous." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of misunderstanding and pain. Chloe wiped at her face with the sleeve of her sweater, a gesture so unlike her usual careful composure that it emphasized how completely her world had collapsed. "He controlled everything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see it at the time because it was so gradual, so careful. He'd comment that certain clothes made me look less elegant, so I stopped wearing them. He'd suggest that some of my friends were beneath us socially, so I drifted away from them. He created my schedule, decided which events we'd attend, which couples we'd socialize with. I thought he was helping me become more sophisticated, more worthy of his success. She pulled her knees up to her chest, curling into herself in my office chair like a child seeking comfort. "I wanted to go back to school, you know. I wanted to study fashion design. I'd sketched design since I was a teenager, had notebooks full of ideas. But Marcus said it would be embarrassing for his wife to be in classes with kids half her age, that I should focus on supporting his career instead of pursuing childish hobbies. So I did. I became the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinners and attending charity events, and making sure I looked good enough to reflect well on him. I buried everything I actually wanted because I thought that's what love required." I'd known Chloe liked fashion, had watched her spend hours shopping and coordinating outfits. but I'd never known she wanted to design, that she had creative aspirations our parents had dismissed the same way they'd dismissed my academic ones. "Mom and Dad knew you wanted to study design?" I asked. Chloe nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I told them when I was 18. Dad laughed and said I should focus on my looks while I had them, that pretty girls don't need careers. Mom said design school was a waste of money when I could just marry well and buy whatever clothes I wanted. They never took it seriously. They never took anything I wanted seriously unless it fit their image of who I should be." She uncurled slightly, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something raw and honest that stripped away all the pretense. "I never wanted to be the golden child, Evelyn. I know you think I loved every minute of the attention, but I didn't. I was their trophy, their proof that they'd raised someone perfect. Every compliment about my looks came with pressure to maintain that appearance. Every celebration of my achievements came with the expectation that I'd achieve even more. I couldn't fail, couldn't be ordinary, couldn't have a bad day or make a mistake without disappointing them. You at least had freedom. You could dress however you wanted, pursue whatever interested you, disappear into your own life. I was on display constantly." The comparison was so absurd, so divorced from my experience of being dismissed and diminished, that I felt anger flare before understanding tempered it. She'd been trapped in a gilded cage while I'd been left in the cold, and neither situation had been healthy or fair. "Chloe," I said carefully, "I didn't have freedom. I had neglect. I had a family that made me feel worthless every single day of my life. You got attention, even if it came with pressure. I got nothing." She nodded, accepting the correction. "You're right. I'm not saying my experience was worse than yours. I'm just saying neither of us got what we actually needed. They broke us both, just in different ways." She looked at me then with hollow eyes that had seen too much truth too quickly, her face stripped of all the beauty that had defined her value to everyone else. "I know you hate me. I deserve it. But I need you to know I envied you. You were allowed to be invisible. I was never allowed to be real." Chloe's confession about envying my invisibility had shifted something in how I viewed what needed to happen next. Marcus Wellington hadn't just targeted me, he'd weaponized our family's dysfunction, and our parents had unknowingly handed him the tools. 3 days after Chloe's visit, I'd sent identical messages to my parents and sister. "Family meeting, Saturday soon p.m., Marcello's private dining room. This is not optional. What I have to show you affects all of us." They'd arrived looking anxious and diminished, my parents older and more haggard than I'd ever seen them, Chloe still hollow-eyed from her shattered marriage. I was already seated when they entered, my laptop positioned in front of me, connected to a large monitor the restaurant had set up. My father started to speak, but I held up one hand. "Sit down, don't talk, just watch." The video I'd queued up had been obtained through legal channels involving the federal investigation. The footage showed Marcus in his office with his business partner David Kellerman 8 months ago, both relaxed with whiskey, having what they thought was a private conversation. I pressed play. "So the wedding's set for June," video Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "Chloe's already picked out the dress, spent a fortune. She's so excited about becoming Mrs. Wellington, it's almost sad." Kellerman laughed. "You really think this marriage scheme is going to work?" Marcus took a sip of whiskey. "She'll bite. The whole family dynamic is perfect. They treat Evelyn like garbage, so she stays distant. Meanwhile, Chloe is desperate for validation. I give her attention, and she doesn't question anything." I glanced at my family. My mother had one hand pressed to her mouth. My father's face had gone gray. Chloe stared at the screen with fixed intensity. "Here's the beautiful part," Marcus continued. "Chloe's just a key to unlock Evelyn. Once we're family, I've got the perfect angle to pressure Hart Capital into investing. And if that doesn't work, the parents will pressure her. They're desperate to look good socially. Once we get Hart Capital money, once the business is stable, I'll divorce the idiot and move on." Kellerman raised his glass. "You're a ruthless bastard. So she really has no idea." Marcus shook his head, grinning. "None. She thinks I'm in love with her." It's pathetic how easy it is to manipulate someone who's been told they're special because of their looks their whole life. I paused the video. Chloe had collapsed forward, head in her hands, shoulders shaking. My father looked like he might be sick. My mother was crying quietly. I let the silence fill the room, letting them absorb Marcus's manipulation. When I spoke, my voice was cold and controlled. This man targeted our entire family. He researched me for months, identified our dysfunctional dynamics, and exploited them perfectly. He married Chloe not because he loved her, but because he saw her as a tool. I looked at each of them. And you handed me to him on a silver platter by treating me like garbage. If you'd loved me, if you'd treated me like family, I might have warned you. I might have investigated him before he got close to Chloe. But you didn't love me. So I stayed away, and none of you were protected. The family meeting had ended with my parents unable to speak, Chloe still sobbing, and me walking out without offering comfort. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca Chen from American Profiles, one of the country's most watched news programs, called with an offer. We've heard about your story, Ms. Hart. We think your experience could resonate with millions of women who felt undervalued by those who should have supported them most. Would you consider an interview? I'd discussed it with Victoria that evening. Once you tell this story publicly, you can't take it back, she'd said. Your family will be exposed, scrutinized, judged by millions. But it might also be necessary for you and for all the other daughters who need to hear they're not alone. The interview was filmed in Manhattan during the 6th month. Rebecca Chen had a reputation for getting subjects to open up without sensationalizing their pain. After questions about Hart Capital Group's success, she'd shifted. Evelyn, I want to talk about where you came from. Can you tell us about your family? I'd taken a breath, feeling the camera's eye on me. I grew up as the invisible daughter. I'd begun, and then years of buried pain started flowing. I described my childhood in Chloe's shadow, the constant comparisons, being denied the scholarship, my parents' explicit message that I wasn't worth investing in. Then I told her about the wedding. They seated you by the entrance and labeled you as security personnel, Rebecca repeated. At your own sister's wedding. I nodded, then described Victoria Chen and 9 other powerful figures arriving, the reversal that left my family speechless. That must have felt vindicating, she prompted. It did, I admitted, but also sad, because it took 10 billionaires showing up to make my parents realize they might have misjudged me. I talked about Victoria's role, the bus station encounter, this remarkable woman who'd seen potential in a desperate 17-year-old. Victoria Chen saved my life by showing me that being underestimated wasn't a death sentence. It was information I could use. I described building Hart Capital Group, the strategic decision to hide my identity, proving that overlooked talent could excel beyond anyone's expectations. As we approached the end, Rebecca asked the question I'd known was coming. Evelyn, after everything your parents did or didn't do you forgive them? The studio went quiet. I sat with the question for a long moment. I'm working on understanding them, I said finally. I recently discovered my mother experienced similar treatment from her own mother, that this pattern goes back generations. That knowledge doesn't erase what was done to me, but it adds context. I paused, looking into the camera. Forgiveness? That's harder. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I'm trying to transform the pain into something useful to support other people who've been told they're not enough. The interview aired 2 weeks later and exploded within hours. Clips were shared millions of times. The hashtag #InvisibleDaughter trended worldwide. I'd become a symbol of resilience despite family rejection. Marcus Chen sent me footage from outside my parents' house. The video showed them watching my interview, frozen as I described my childhood. My father's face was expressionless, blank. But my mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter tell the world about the pain she'd caused. The aftermath of the interview unfolded exactly as Victoria had predicted, though even I hadn't anticipated how swift and thorough the social exile would be. I'd expected some fallout, some uncomfortable moments for my family at country club brunches or charity events. What actually happened was far more comprehensive, a complete severing of the social ties they'd spent decades cultivating. I watched it happen through Marcus Chen's surveillance reports and through the social media monitoring my team conducted, observing from a distance as the world they'd built crumbled around them. The first indication came within 48 hours of the broadcast. My father's longtime golfing partner, Thomas Bradford, had sent a brief text that Marcus Chen's team intercepted. "Ray, I think it's best if we take a break from our Saturday games for a while. My wife is uncomfortable given everything that's come out. I'm sure you understand." That message was followed by similar ones from other members of their social circle. Dinner invitations were quietly rescinded. Group chats that had once buzzed with plans for parties and events suddenly went silent whenever my parents contributed. The exclusion was polite but absolute, the kind of social death that happened without anyone explicitly saying what everyone understood. The country club membership was handled with particular cruelty disguised as bureaucracy. Marcus Chen had a contact on the membership committee who'd shared the details with grim satisfaction. My parents had been members for 18 years, had served on various committees, had donated generously to club improvements. But at the annual membership renewal meeting, their application had been quietly set aside. The club president had called my father personally to explain that due to recent changes in membership criteria and an unexpected surge in applications, they regretfully couldn't guarantee renewal for all existing members. The waitlist for reinstatement he'd added with false sympathy was currently 3 years long. Everyone understood what that meant. The Hart family was no longer welcome among the city's respectable elite. My father's business suffered even more tangibly. Ray Hart and Associates was a small consulting firm that had built its client base largely through personal relationships and social connections. Those relationships evaporated within weeks of the interview. I'd received reports from business contacts who'd witnessed the exodus, clients finding increasingly creative reasons to terminate contracts. One major account representing nearly 20% of my father's annual revenue had sent a formal letter citing concerns about alignment with our company's values regarding family and workplace culture. Another client had been more direct in an email that had been forwarded to me. "I can't in good conscience continue a business relationship with someone who treated their own daughter the way you treated Evelyn. What does that say about your character and judgment?" The whispers and social media commentary were particularly brutal. I'd created anonymous accounts to monitor what people were saying, and the consensus was damning. Forum threads dissected my family's behavior, with people sharing their own stories of parental favoritism and relating to my experience. My parents' names became synonymous with toxic parenting, used as examples in articles about psychological abuse and family dysfunction. Complete strangers felt entitled to comment on their character, to judge them publicly in ways that would have been unthinkable before the interview. But it was Chloe's situation that complicated my feelings about these consequences. I'd watched her social media presence, once carefully curated and enviably glamorous, go completely dark after Marcus's arrest. The few times she'd ventured out in public based on paparazzi photos that surfaced online, she'd been photographed looking haggard and broken, with tabloid headlines speculating about her role in her husband's crimes, despite the authorities clearing her of involvement. The court had annulled her marriage swiftly once Marcus's manipulation came to light, but the legal dissolution couldn't erase the public humiliation. Marcus Chen had reported that Chloe had moved back into my parents' house 3 weeks after the interview aired, having lost her home when federal assets were seized and having nowhere else to go. The image of Chloe, who'd once been the golden child living in a luxury house with a supposedly successful husband, now back in her childhood bedroom in her 30s, unemployed and socially ostracized, should have felt like justice. Instead, it just felt sad. She'd been Marcus Wellington's victim as much as I had, just in a different way. And now she was paying the price for crimes she hadn't committed, and family dynamics she hadn't created. I'd received one message from Chloe during this period, sent late at night when inhibitions were low and desperation was high. "I can't leave the house without people staring and whispering. A woman at the grocery store actually told me I got what I deserved for enabling abuse. I don't even know what to do anymore. I'm sorry for everything. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. I'd read it 3 times and hadn't responded, not because I was unmoved, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say. The surveillance footage Marcus Chen delivered from outside my parents' house showed the physical manifestation of their isolation. My father spent hours sitting in his home office, staring at his computer screen, probably watching his business collapse in real time. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning rooms that were already clean, organizing things that didn't need organizing anything, to avoid sitting still with her thoughts. But it was one particular piece of footage captured through a window by a long-range camera that stayed with me. Judith sat alone in the living room, surrounded by photo albums she'd pulled from the cabinet. She'd spread them across the coffee table, and even from the grainy footage, I could see she was looking at pictures of me as a child. Her hand would hover over certain photos, touching them gently, then she'd pick up her phone from the cushion beside her. The surveillance had recorded this sequence 3 separate times over the course of an hour. My mother reaching for her phone, pulling up what appeared to be my contact information, staring at it for long seconds, then setting the phone back down without calling. On the 3rd attempt, the audio equipment had been sensitive enough to catch her whisper, barely audible but heartbreaking in its helplessness. What would I even say? Watching that surveillance footage of my mother unable to call me, whispering her helplessness into an empty room, had stirred something I'd been trying to suppress for weeks. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at her suffering, wanted to believe this was exactly what she deserved for 32 years of making me feel worthless. But another part, the part that had read her teenage diary and understood the cycle of pain she'd inherited, felt only a hollow sadness. Victory through destruction was starting to feel less like justice and more like perpetuating the same wound across another generation. That night, unable to sleep, I'd pulled out my grandmother's letter from the safe in my home office, where I'd been keeping it since David Weinstein had given it to me months ago. I'd read it once during that initial meeting, focusing primarily on the inheritance details and the evidence of my parents' betrayal. But Victoria's words from when I'd told her about the interview kept echoing in my mind, that trauma gets passed down until someone decides to break the cycle. I'd said those words on national television without fully processing what they meant for me personally, what responsibility they placed on my shoulders. The letter was longer than I'd remembered, written on both sides of 3 sheets of my grandmother's monogrammed stationery. I'd skimmed past the opening paragraphs during my first reading, eager to get to the inheritance information. Now I read slowly, savoring every word, hearing my grandmother's voice in the careful script. After explaining the unequal distribution of assets and the conditions for my inheritance, she'd continued with something I'd overlooked in my initial anger and pain. "I need you to understand something crucial about your mother, Evelyn," she'd written. "Judith was hurt by her own mother in ways that mirror what she's done to you. Your grandmother, my mother-in-law, was a difficult woman who showed blatant favoritism toward Judith's younger sister, Sarah. She made your mother feel plain inadequate, not good enough to deserve opportunities or attention. I watched it break something. In Judith, watched her internalize the message that she was less valuable than her sister. When your grandfather and I tried to intervene, we were shut out. By the time Judith left home and married your father, the damage was done." I'd stopped reading there, my hand trembling slightly as I held the paper. My grandmother had known. She'd seen the pattern, had understood what was happening, but hadn't been able to stop it. The letter continued with painful honesty. I'd hoped that when Judith became a mother herself, she'd remember her own pain and choose to parent differently. Your grandfather and I talked to her about it when you were born, reminded her how damaging favoritism had been in her childhood. She swore she'd never repeat those mistakes. But trauma doesn't just disappear because we wish it away. It embeds itself in how we see the world, how we react to stress, how we unconsciously recreate familiar patterns, even when we consciously reject them. The next paragraph had been harder to read, my grandmother's words cutting through my justifications and forcing me to see a bigger picture. "Evelyn, your mother was hurt by her mother, who was hurt by hers. I've traced this pattern back 3 generations in our family, this cycle of women undermining their daughters, choosing favorites, passing down pain like a terrible inheritance. Each generation swears they'll be different, and each generation fails in new ways to break free from the pattern. Your test, my darling girl, isn't whether you can succeed in business, or accumulate wealth, or prove your parents wrong. Your test is this: will you break the cycle? I'd felt something crack open in my chest as I read those words, understanding with sudden clarity that my grandmother hadn't just been leaving me money and wisdom. She'd been giving me a choice and a challenge. The letter went on to explain what breaking the cycle meant in practical terms. Breaking the cycle doesn't mean pretending the hurt never happened or excusing the people who caused it. It means understanding the difference between justice and revenge, between protecting yourself and perpetuating harm. It means becoming the person you needed when you were young, not just for yourself, but for others who are suffering the same way you suffered. My grandmother's handwriting had become shakier toward the end of the letter, and I imagined her writing this in her final months, knowing she was running out of time to share what she'd learned. I've watched your mother struggle with her own demons for 30 years, Evelyn. I've seen her repeat the mistakes that were made with her despite genuinely loving both you and your sister. That's the insidious thing about generational trauma. It doesn't require malice or conscious cruelty. It just requires pain that hasn't been healed, patterns that haven't been interrupted, cycles that continue because no one has the strength or wisdom to say, "This stops with me." The final paragraph was the one that undid me completely, that made tears stream down my face as I sat alone in my office at 2 a.m. Don't let hate consume you, my darling. I know what they've done to you. I know how deep the wounds go. But your success shouldn't be about revenge. It should be about becoming the person you needed when you were young. Build your empire, prove them wrong, show the world what you're capable of. But don't let the need for vindication poison what you're building. Don't become so focused on making them pay that you lose sight of who you actually want to be. You have a chance to do what your mother couldn't, to break the cycle, to heal yourself, and in doing so, to offer healing to others. That's your real inheritance from me, not money, but the possibility of freedom from this generational curse. I'd closed the letter and sat there in the darkness, my grandmother's words settling over me like a weight and a release simultaneously. Everything I'd done for the past 6 months had been justified as justice, as holding people accountable for their actions. But how much of it had really been about breaking cycles, and how much had simply been about inflicting the same kind of pain I'd experienced, just in different forms? My family was suffering now, isolated and broken. But what had that suffering actually accomplished, besides proving I had the power to hurt them back? I'd picked up my phone, my hands still trembling slightly, and pulled up my parents' contact information. My mother's question from the surveillance footage echoed in my mind. What would I even say? I understood that helplessness now, the paralysis that came from knowing you'd caused irreparable damage and having no idea how to begin making it right. But my grandmother's words had shown me something important. Someone had to be brave enough to start the conversation, to take the risk of reaching out even when there were no guarantees of how it would be received. I'd typed slowly, choosing each word carefully, knowing this message would either begin a new chapter or close the book entirely. The tears were still streaming down my face as I wrote, "We need to talk. One final time." I'd sent the message at 2 a.m, and by 8 the next morning, my father had replied, "Yes, when and where." We'd arranged to meet the following week at Riley's Diner, a modest family restaurant with vinyl booths and laminated menus. The choice was deliberate, not Marcello's, not any upscale establishment. This meeting would happen on neutral ground that reflected their current reality, not the illusion they'd maintained. I'd arrived early, claiming a corner booth, and watched them pull up in my father's dented car. They walked in together, moving like people who'd been broken and badly reassembled. My father had aged a decade, his hair completely gray, shoulders rounded. My mother had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, clothes hanging loosely. And Chloe wore minimal makeup, dark circles under her eyes, speaking of too many sleepless nights. They slid into the booth across from me without their once confident ease. My father opened his mouth first. "Evelyn, I want to start by saying how sorry. but I raised my hand, stopping him. "I don't need sorry," I said quietly. "I need you to understand what you did. Because I don't think you do not really. You're sorry there were consequences, sorry your social life fell apart. But do you actually understand the damage you caused?" The silence was thick and uncomfortable. "I need you to hear some things, and I need you to really listen, not just wait to defend yourselves." I took a breath. "Do you remember my 8th birthday? Chloe's 10th had been at that indoor playground with 25 kids, a bouncy castle, a magician? You spent over $1,000. 2 months later, you told me we couldn't afford a party for me. We had cake at home. Chloe got 3 presents. I got one a book about practical careers." My mother winced, but I pressed on. "My high school graduation. I was valedictorian. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon. You told me you couldn't make it because you had to drive Chloe to look at college campuses 3 hours away. Her tours could have happened any weekend that summer, but you chose that specific day. I gave my speech to a crowd of families, and mine wasn't there." Chloe had tears streaming down her face. I turned to her. "And you knew. You knew they weren't coming. You could have said something, could have told them to reschedule, but you didn't. You just accepted that your college tours were more important than my graduation." Every Christmas morning, I continued, my voice steady. Chloe would have a pile of presents while I'd have 3 or 4 small items. Every family dinner where you'd ask Chloe detailed questions about her day, then barely acknowledge my presence. Every time someone complimented Chloe and you'd beam with pride, then look at me and find something to criticize. My clothes were wrong, my hair was messy, my interests were boring. For 32 years you sent me the same message over and over: Chloe matters, and you don't. My father's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks. "We didn't mean we never intended." I shook my head. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You may not have intended to destroy my self-worth, but you did. And when I succeeded despite you, when I built something extraordinary without any help from my family, your first instinct wasn't pride. It was to figure out how to benefit from my success." That's when my mother finally broke completely. She'd been crying quietly, but now her whole body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded. "I became my mother," she gasped out between sobs, her voice raw and broken. "The woman I swore I'd never be. I destroyed my daughter because I couldn't heal myself. I repeated every single thing that was done to me, told myself I was doing it differently, but I wasn't. I was just making new excuses for the same cruelty." She looked up at me then with devastated, pleading eyes, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "Can you ever forgive me?" My mother's question hung in the air between us, raw and desperate. "Can you ever forgive me?" I'd spent months imagining this moment, rehearsing various responses that ranged from cold rejection to cautious acceptance. But sitting across from them now, seeing the genuine devastation in their faces, I found that none of my rehearsed answers fit. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice steady but not unkind. "But forgiveness isn't why I asked you here. I asked you here because we need to establish terms for moving forward, whether that leads to reconciliation or not." I'd pulled out a folder from my bag, the same kind of manila folder that had held so many revelations over the past months, and set it on the table between us. "I have evidence that you forged my grandparents' will and stole $4.3 million from my inheritance. That's a felony that carries 5 to 10 years in prison." My father had gone even paler, if that was possible, and my mother's hands had started shaking. "I could turn this evidence over to the district attorney tomorrow. I have every legal right to do so, and honestly, part of me wants to. But that's not what grandmother would have wanted, and more importantly, it's not what breaking the cycle looks like." I'd opened the folder and slid a document across to them. "These are my terms. First, you will write a public statement acknowledging the favoritism and emotional neglect I experienced growing up. It doesn't need to be long or overly detailed, but it needs to be honest. You'll post it to your social media and send it to the local newspaper. You'll own what you did instead of hiding from it." Chloe had nodded immediately, but my parents looked stricken. "That will destroy what's left of our reputation," my father had said quietly. "You've already destroyed your reputation by your actions," I'd replied. "This just makes you accountable for it." "Second," I'd continued, "you'll sell your house and any remaining assets of value and donate the proceeds to a foundation I've established called the Invisible Daughters Fund. It provides scholarships, therapy, and support services for young women who've been neglected or undervalued by their families. The foundation already has substantial funding from me, but your contribution will be symbolic. It's you taking the resources you should have used to support me and directing them toward helping others like me." My mother had gasped. "Sell our house? Where would we live?" I'd met her gaze steadily. "You'll figure it out the same way I figured out how to build a life after you denied me opportunities. There are apartments, smaller houses, options for people who don't have wealth. You'll learn to live within your actual means instead of means stolen from me. Third, and most important," I'd said, pulling out another document, "you'll all attend family therapy. I've already arranged for you to work with Dr. Sarah Brennan, one of the best trauma specialists in the state. She's agreed to take you on. You'll attend weekly sessions for a minimum of 1 year. This isn't about reconciling with me. This is about you doing the work to heal yourselves so you don't continue passing this pain forward." My father had looked at me with something between desperation and bitterness. "And if we do, all this, will you forgive us? Will we be a family again?" The question had come out harsh, demanding, as if forgiveness was something he could earn through completing tasks like items on a checklist. I'd looked at each of them, my broken father, my devastated mother, my shattered sister, and given them the only honest answer I had. "That's not guaranteed, but you'll be able to live with yourselves. That's more than you gave me." I'd left the diner that day with no resolution, just 3 shell-shocked family members holding documents that outlined their path forward. Over the next 2 weeks, they'd begun complying. The public statement had been posted, brief but honest. The house had been listed for sale. Dr. Brennan confirmed all 3 had attended their first therapy session. But there was one piece of unfinished business. The legal paperwork to reclaim my stolen inheritance sat on my desk, requiring only my signature to recover the $4.2 million my parents had taken. David Weinstein had built an airtight case documenting the fraud. I'd asked Victoria to meet me at David's office on a Thursday afternoon, wanting her perspective before making this final decision. David spread the documents across his conference table. "The path forward is straightforward," he explained. "We file the fraud claim, the court orders restitution, and the funds are transferred within 60 to 90 days. Given the clear evidence of forgery, there's virtually no chance of being contested." I picked up the papers, thinking about what $4.2 million could mean. Security, luxury, never worrying about money again. It was mine by right, stolen through deliberate criminal action. Every logical argument said I should reclaim what was rightfully mine. But my grandmother's letter kept echoing in my mind, her challenge about breaking cycles, her wisdom about what real inheritance meant. "Before you sign," Victoria said quietly, "I want you to consider something. Your grandparents set up that inheritance with conditions because they wanted to test whether you could succeed without it. They wanted to know if you'd build something meaningful through your own strength. You've done that. Hart Capital Group is worth over $2 billion. Your personal net worth is approximately $80 million. You've proven everything they wanted you to prove." I set down the reclamation papers and pulled out different documents, ones I'd had my own attorneys prepare. "I know what I want to do," I said, "and it's not about the money." The documents I laid out were transfer papers for the Invisible Daughters Fund, the foundation I'd established to help young women experiencing family neglect. "I want to sign this inheritance over to the foundation, all $4.2 million. It goes towards scholarships, therapy services, housing assistance for girls who need to escape toxic families, mentorship programs connecting them with successful women who can guide them." David looked surprised, starting to speak about tax implications, but Victoria held up her hand, stopping him. She was smiling that warm expression that told me she'd expected exactly this decision. "Your grandparents wanted to know you'd succeed without needing their money," she said softly. "You just proved that. And you proved something more important, that you understand wealth isn't about hoarding resources. It's about using them to create the kind of support you wish you'd had." I signed the papers quickly before any practical considerations could make me second guess. David witnessed the signature formalizing the transfer, and I sat back feeling lighter than I had in months. I looked at the signed papers that redirected my grandmother's money toward helping others and said, "They wanted me to break the cycle of pain. I'm not doing that by hoarding money. I'm doing it by making sure other girls don't feel as alone as I did." The 2 months following the inheritance decision had been quieter. I'd maintained distance from my family, receiving occasional updates from Dr. Brennan about their therapy progress, but not engaging directly. Then, in the 9th month, an envelope arrived at my office, hand-addressed in Chloe's distinctive handwriting. Inside was an invitation. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of Visible Boutique." The name caught my attention immediately. Visible. I understood the reference, the irony of my sister who'd spent her life in the spotlight, choosing a name that spoke to invisibility. A personal note accompanied the invitation. "I'd really like you to be there. No pressure. I'll understand if you can't come. But I wanted you to know you're welcome." I'd debated for 3 days before deciding to go, curious about what Chloe had built and willing to acknowledge she was at least trying to change. The boutique was in a modest neighborhood, not the high-end shopping district where she would have once insisted on being. The storefront was small but beautifully designed, the window display featuring elegant pieces that showed professional design work. When I walked in, Chloe looked up from helping a customer, her face registering surprise and relief. After finishing with the customer, she approached with hesitant steps. "You came," she said simply. "I wasn't sure you would." The boutique was lovely, filled with clothing that felt both sophisticated and wearable pieces showing real creative vision. "Did you design all of this?" I asked, touching a jacket with interesting structural details. Chloe nodded, and for the first time in my memory, I saw genuine pride in her expression that wasn't about appearance or status, but about something she'd created herself. "I started taking classes 6 weeks after our meeting at the diner," she explained, walking me through the space. "Design fundamentals, pattern-making, business management for fashion entrepreneurs. I used money I'd saved before the marriage, everything Marcus never knew about. It's not much, but it's mine." She gestured around the boutique. "I'm learning to be my own person, like you always were. Thank you for showing me it's possible." The words felt genuine, stripped of the performance that had characterized most of our interactions growing up. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation awkward but not hostile, 2 sisters trying to figure out if there was any relationship to salvage from the wreckage. When I moved toward the door, preparing to leave, Chloe called out behind me, her voice catching slightly. "I know I don't deserve a sister after what I allowed, but if you ever want to try, I'm here." I paused in the doorway, my hand on the frame, feeling the weight of that offer. I turned back to look at her standing in her small boutique, surrounded by her own creations, no longer the golden child or the trophy wife, but just Chloe, trying to become someone real. I nodded slightly, not a promise, but an acknowledgement. Not reconciliation, but a door left slightly open. 1 year after walking out of Chloe's boutique, I stood backstage at the National Women's Empowerment Summit, listening to 5,000 voices filling the convention center. The organizers had asked me to deliver the closing keynote, and I'd agreed, knowing this would be the platform to share not just my business success, but the human story behind it. Victoria was seated in the front row, her silver hair catching the stage lights. Beside her sat the 10 women who'd emerged from those limousines at Chloe's wedding, my chosen sisters who'd stood by me through everything. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Congresswoman Reeves, Richard Thornton, all present, not out of obligation, but genuine affection. Then my assistant whispered something that made my breath catch. My family was here, seated in the very back row. They hadn't asked permission. They'd simply come. I walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The lights were bright, the crowd enormous, but I felt calm. I'd told versions of this story before, but never all of it, never with the full context of both pain and healing. I started with the wedding, describing that table by the entrance and the place card that labeled me security personnel. I heard gasps from the audience, murmurs of recognition from women who'd experienced their own versions of family rejection. I spoke about building Heart Capital Group in secret, about Victoria finding me at a bus station when I was 17 and lost, about the choice to either destroy my family completely or offer them a path toward accountability and healing. I talked about discovering my mother's diary and understanding generational trauma, about Marcus Wellington's manipulation, about Chloe's transformation. Most importantly, I spoke about the decision to break the cycle, to choose purpose over revenge, to transform pain into something that could help others. As I reached my conclusion, I looked out at that vast audience and spoke directly to every woman who'd ever felt invisible. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who see you when you're invisible, believe in you when you doubt yourself, and stand beside you when everyone else walks away. I found my family. I gestured toward Victoria and the 10 women in the front row. And to every woman listening who feels unseen, you are not alone. Your story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. The room erupted. Victoria stood first, her face radiant with pride, followed immediately by the 10 women beside her. Then the entire audience rose as 5,000 women on their feet, applause, rolling through the convention center like thunder. Through the lights, I could see the back row where my family sat. My father's head was bowed. Chloe was clapping with tears streaming down her face. And my mother had both hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I stood there in the spotlight, no longer the invisible daughter or the bitter victim, or even the successful CEO seeking vindication. Just Evelyn Hart, finally, truly free. And that's where Evelyn's journey brought her. From the invisible daughter seated by the entrance at her own sister's wedding to a woman who built an empire, exposed the truth, and chose healing over endless revenge. She broke the cycle of generational pain that had haunted her family for decades, transforming her suffering into a foundation that now helps thousands of young women who feel just as unseen as she once did. But here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Evelyn made the right choice by giving her family a chance at redemption instead of destroying them completely? Was forgiving her mother too easy, or was it the bravest thing she could have done? And what about Chloe? Can sisters who've been pitted against each other their whole lives truly rebuild their relationship? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or if you know someone who needs to hear Evelyn's message, please subscribe to the channel and share this video. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for listening, and remember, your story isn't over. It's just beginning.